Program information is always available to viewers by calling the C-SPAN schedule hotline. That number is 202-628-2205.
Saturday, you'll see a speech by Neil Rudenstein, president of Harvard University. He spoke earlier this week at the National Press Club. In his address, he discussed education reform, financial aid, and accessibility to education on the university level. After the speech, Mr. Rudenstein responded to questions from members of the Washington Press Corps. Saturday on C-SPAN, beginning at 6 p.m. Eastern Time.
Coming next, we take you to Capitol Hill for today's hearing of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs. This marks the fourth time in as many days the committee has met in a final round of public hearings. For the past year, this panel has been holding meetings and conducting negotiations with Vietnamese officials in an effort to come up with a more accurate accounting of the more than 2,300 U.S. servicemen still listed as prisoners of war or missing in action in Southeast Asia. Earlier this week, the group focused on the role of the Defense Intelligence Agency in resolving the POW MIA issue and fundraising efforts aimed at keeping the issue alive. The senators also heard from families of missing servicemen. Testifying at today's hearing were people who have been involved in investigations of POW MIA cases. Among them, General John Vesey, Special Presidential Emissary to Vietnam, and Admiral Charles Larson, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Forces. This was the last hearing the committee will hold before its congressional authorization expires at the end of this month. The committee will next issue a report with conclusions and some recommendations for the 103rd Congress and the new presidential administration. And with that background information, we take you now to the Hart Senate Office Building for the start of today's hearing. The proceedings were gavelled to order by the committee chairman, Democratic U.S. Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts.
The Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs will come to order. We meet this morning in our last public hearing, and I just want to take a couple of minutes, if I may, to comment on where the committee has been and where it goes from here. As everybody knows, we were created to seek answers to questions that should have been answered a long time ago. And we were also created to try to reestablish trust between the government and the American people on this painful issue. It's been our job to investigate and to lay before the American people the most complete story possible about what our government knows, what it's doing, and what has been done over the years about MIA's POW. It's been our job to try to ensure that the accounting for missing Americans is going to be, not just in word, but in practice, a matter of the highest national priority, and to encourage real cooperation and the production of real answers from foreign governments, and particularly from the government of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Whether we will have succeeded in all of the tasks that the committee was charged with is really up to the American people and for the public record to determine at a later time. Clearly, we can't claim to have learned, nor could we have hoped to have learned everything. I don't think anybody ever will. But we will leave behind a public record that is unprecedented, and I believe that will open up a window on every single critical aspect of this issue. And that record will soon be very much in the public's hands. That record includes the most rapid and extensive declassification of public files and documents on a single issue in American history. It includes a set of hearings and committee files in which virtually every part of the POW MIA controversy has been examined. It includes disclosure after disclosure about aspects of U.S. policy and actions that have never before been made public. It includes a contribution to changed policies that is reflected on the ground in Southeast Asia in the form of unprecedented access to documents and facilities that bear on the fate of our missing servicemen, though we know there is more yet to accomplish. It includes an understanding with the executive branch that has yielded a process of live sighting response, investigation, and evaluation that is more extensive and professional than ever before. Of special importance, the record of this committee provides, at least in my view, is a validation of those who called for the creation of this committee in the first place, the families, the veterans organizations, responsible activists, and others who said that this committee was necessary, and I believe that they've been proven right. They were right when they said that the full story was not being told. They were right when they said that a stronger focus on this issue would yield new answers and new results. It has. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to those whose dedication and whose determination led to the creation of this committee, including my Vice Chairman. As Chairman, I must say that I feel an obligation as well to thank the members of this committee, because it's their cooperation and their dedication that has enabled us to succeed in operating in what I think most people will agree that while there have been disagreements on the issues involving POW, they have not been partisan. This committee has operated on a nonpartisan basis. And it's because of the members that we've pursued the investigation into areas of this issue that no previous inquiry, notwithstanding some 13 or more separate efforts, had even thought of touching. And we have been tough and I think insistent on the critical question of declassification, and we have demonstrated both to our own government and to those overseas that we and those we represented are united in our desire to get the truth, not an official version of the truth, not a sanitized version of the truth, but the truth about this issue. I also want to thank all of those who came forward to assist the committee in its work, and obviously, parenthetically, for those who were not willing to come forward, I suppose there is a parenthetical condemnation. But whether through public testimony or otherwise, I doubt that any committee can compete with this one for the variety and the quality and often the raw emotional power of the testimony presented. We've had cabinet secretaries, generals, admirals, both halves of a presidential campaign ticket, technical experts, a KGB colonel, a Russian general, a former colonel in the North Vietnamese Army, a host of American citizens and soldiers whose testimony about lost loved ones have been the most compelling of all. Many of our witnesses sacrificed a great deal in time and convenience, not to mention money, to be here. Others feel that they have been forced to wait far too long to state their case in public. But all have contributed to our committee's work, and all can take a measure of pride for their participation in this process. I say that because it seems to me that however one views the evidence with respect to our POW MIAs, the hearings and the investigations that we have conducted this past year provide grounds not so much for pride in this committee, but I think pride in our system of government. Let us not forget that the committee's very existence is a testament to the effectiveness of public action, and although some may have found the process disagreeable and even painful, and some still may have asserted unnecessary, at times I happen to believe that the rigorous examination of current and former government officials on a matter of urgent public interest is what democratic accountability is all about. And I might add that this process of rigorous public questioning has quite often been directed at the committee itself as well, and I believe that that too has been healthy and appropriate. Within the next month, we'll issue our final report. Let me just announce one thing regarding that. We said at the outset we were going to target the end of December. We're going to, in order to make sure we do some of the things that a number of members have raised in the last days and not to be, quote, rushed to judgment, we purposefully left a cushion in that schedule. And because of scheduling problems with senators in terms of getting together before the Christmas holidays, we're going to try to complete the report, but we're going to release the report on the 5th of January when the committee returns. I think I speak for every member when I say that and I've said this again and again throughout the hearings, as has the Vice Chairman, our commitment on this issue does not terminate, nor will the inquiry terminate, nor does the process of accountability terminate when this committee sunsets. There will be outstanding questions, and these can and will be pursued through the standing committee process of the Senate. However, we will have, through our investigation and our report, I think, put this issue into context. And we will, I believe, have shed significant truth on it. We have always acknowledged there will still be questions. We will raise many of those questions. We will leave some of them hanging out there, but I am confident that the process will continue to seek the answers to them. There is no way, as long as Senator Smith is in the Senate, Senator McCain is in the Senate, and I am in the Senate, and I think I speak for the other members, Senator Robb, Senator Daschle, Senator Brown, all veterans, Senator Bob Kerrey, Senator Helms, Senator Grassley. These are people dedicated to the truth, and as long as we are here and there are questions left unanswered, we will continue to pursue them. I'd just like to, this is not a time for a whole lot of hullabaloo. We have a lot of work left to do, but since it is the last public hearing, I would like to particularly thank the Vice Chairman for his commitment, which has really been extraordinary on this issue, for his willingness to work as closely as he has, sometimes under difficult circumstances because of the passions of this issue and the pressures that people outside bring to bear on it. But I think everyone in this committee has worked in a commendable fashion to try to get at the truth, and I'm grateful for his support in doing so. I also want to thank all of our staff people publicly who work extraordinary hours to make these hearings possible, to pull the information together, and whose work is cut out for them in the next weeks to compile the report and pull all of the information together. Today's hearing is really an appropriate final hearing. We'll hear from General Vesey, whose distinguished record and whose extraordinary work on this issue are responsible in large measure for where we are today, and who has, I think, is great in expertise on where we stand and where we're getting and where we have yet to go as any person in the country. And we will hear from the team that is on the ground, from the officers in command, and from many of those in the field who are doing the day-to-day work of trying to account and find the answers for families. And I think their testimony is equally as riveting because of the dangers they face, the difficulties of the work, the difficulty of the living conditions. And I think they will shed great light on where we have traveled to in the last year and a half and of what is yet to be done. So this is an appropriate way to wrap up. It is a judgment, really, if you will, of what the government is doing today, of where we really are, and it will be also a response to some of the issues raised by families yesterday as a way, at least, of closing out the public portion of our hearing process. Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks of the Chairman in terms of the summary of where the committee has been and the work that we still have to do, and support his decision to have the final report issued in January, when all of the members will be here and we'll have the opportunity to take the maximum amount of time to get the input that we need into the final report. Being sunsetted is not a pleasant experience when you're getting down to the end, but as the Chairman has said, a final report is just that, a final report. It does not necessarily mean it's the end of the issue, and of course it's not. There will be many questions that we will not answer, and we will say that in the final report. So there need not be a concern on that. But today we are meeting to examine current U.S. intelligence policy and accounting efforts pertaining to the missing in Southeast Asia. And in the last 3 days, we've heard from numerous witnesses concerning both successes and failures regarding U.S. efforts since the war. In my judgment, the witnesses have shown that there have been many failures on the part of our government in the past, but we've also seen sincere efforts by former President Reagan in 1982 to raise this issue to the priority that it deserved. And to some degree, we've also seen how misinformation has been spread outside the government and a lack of parallel priority at the analytical level inside the government as well. Indeed, as Admiral Brooks and Colonel Gaines outlined on Tuesday, there has been a mindset to debunk, if you will, at times for a variety of reasons, even after the priority was raised. But while I'm convinced that the consciousness of the American people was raised on the issue in mostly positive ways, I'm not convinced that this raised consciousness and renewed determination filtered down to the lower levels of our bureaucracy always. Mindsets may have been created years ago based on past policies and past decisions. Sometimes that's a fault of the process or the system itself, not necessarily individuals. Let there be no mistake, however, that it is the Communist Vietnamese and the Laotian governments that are directly responsible for causing this committee to meet this week and for basically causing the creation of the committee in the first place. For nearly 20 years, they've consistently dragged their feet on what they have known about American POWs and MIAs. They put the families on a roller coaster ride of on-again, off-again cooperation, and they've dribbled out remains, in most cases, for their own political reasons. These actions and delays are grotesque and they're reprehensible. And I would hope and expect that the world community would share this view, and I think they do. The failures of the U.S. government and the actions of some private individuals, and there have been many, pale in comparison to what Vietnam and Laos have done. We know there are many unaccounted for U.S. servicemen who were captured by North Vietnamese and Lao forces during the war. We know this to be true. It's inconceivable to me, in view of their meticulous record-keeping and knowledge, that they don't know what happened to many of these men. I believe that they do. The communist leadership of the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese, which is still around today, had to have known about the men who were captured but not returned to the United States. It's my judgment they could produce far more results than they have, although I'm pleased any time actions by Vietnam or Laos have resulted in the final answer for a family member. I don't condone their overall actions throughout the last 20 years. Based on the history of this issue, the central question for the U.S. now is what is the best and most effective strategy to gain the fullest possible accounting? Is there an effective strategy in place today, and is it producing results? I know our witnesses will address this question with complete frankness before this committee. Without openness and frankness and acknowledgement of the facts, it will be much more difficult for the committee to make its recommendations to the full Senate and to the incoming President. The efforts at the Paris Peace Talks in 1973 to get a full accounting obviously failed. President Nixon acknowledged that the deal with Hanoi was unraveling on national television just 2 months after the agreement was signed. Although I don't believe he was correct in telling the nation that everybody in Southeast Asia were on their way home, he did acknowledge, as Senator McCain has already pointed out, the lack of a North Vietnamese accounting for our missing men. Unfortunately, any strategy the U.S. may have had from that point forward didn't work. By the late 70s, remaining MIAs under President Carter's administration were simply declared dead. One memorandum dated May 26, 1977 from the Secretary of Defense stated that in the long run, continuing to carry these personnel as missing in action would force us to make concessions to Hanoi. The record will show, and the Vietnamese have confirmed, that during this period, an accounting was not forcefully pressed by the United States. And that is one of the reasons we are here today, so many years later. The families, though, were smart enough to realize that in most cases, an administration declaration of death was not a final accounting. The effect of any U.S. strategy on this issue during this period was a House Select Committee report and a presidential commission, which nearly closed the issue forever. In fact, this morning, ironically, I retrieved from our files a document from a government status review board in 1979, which met to consider the fate of one serviceman listed as missing in action. In making their determination that the MIA was to be declared dead, the board stated, quote, We also considered the final report of the House Select Committee on Missing Persons and the report of the Presidential Commission on American Missing and Unaccounted For in Southeast Asia," unquote. The families of our missing servicemen were basically outraged by these reports because they knew that in many cases only Hanoi, not the U.S., but only Hanoi, had the final answers on their missing loved ones. Many of those family members are here today, including the board members of the National League. I see Sue Scott is here, and other members will be here later today. And I'd like to thank them for being here because they and all the POW MIA families have really experienced the history of this issue. And they also keep that helps to keep us in perspective, keep the issue in perspective. We heard from many family members and family groups, including Sybil Stockdale, that even during the war, the government simply did not level with the families and the public on the plight of our POWs and MIAs. Much of the activism on this issue over the years deserves praise, not criticism, from this committee. They have kept the pressure on and have forced us to address the issue head-on. Due to the persistent efforts of the families and the personal commitments of President Reagan and President Bush over the last 12 years, the issue is back where it belongs, on the front burner. Because of this, I believe Hanoi is now beginning to truly understand our resolve, more so than at any point since the end of the war. They understand that we look forward to the day when our diplomatic and economic relations will be normalized, but they also understand there's an unfinished business which prevents us from moving toward that business with Hanoi. And we all understand what that unfinished business is. General Vesey, the President's Special Emissary to Vietnam, deserves the gratitude of every American for his persistent efforts over the last 5 years to address this unfinished business. He has had literally scores of meetings with the Vietnamese, not to mention scores of meetings with us and other members of Congress, and his efforts have indeed brought answers and results for our families and our missing men. However, many families during this period have not received answers that I believe Vietnam could and should and have the ability to readily provide. In this regard, I look forward to hearing from General Vesey this morning on how much information could be readily provided by the Vietnamese, and I'll also be interested in hearing whether General Vesey believes that the negotiating authority of his position should be expanded, or whether that might help, and whether that might help us to achieve better results. Not necessarily with you personally, General Vesey, as I know you've given many, many years of service, but in terms of the job itself as to whether that should be expanded. I also want to commend Admiral Larson and his team and SINCPAC for their dedication to the mission of the Joint Task Force Full Accounting, and look forward to hearing from his team members. Their insights will be critical. Finally, I look forward to hearing further from the POW-MIA policymakers at the Department of Defense and Department of State. And, Mr. Chairman, in closing, I want to return the compliment to you and thank you for your leadership and assistance to me on the committee over the period of the last year. It's not been easy for either one of us. There are many times when there is legitimate reason, I suppose, from pressures to divide us, but we've always had an open communication. It's been a truly nonpartisan committee, and you've heard that before from other committees, but in this case it's true. Initially, by agreement of the Chairman and myself, we seated the members of this committee, not Republicans on one side and Democrats on the other, but alternating. We've gotten to know each other a lot better. We've communicated as members of the Senate, not as Republicans and Democrats, and I think that's a tribute to the leadership of Senator Kerry that happened, and it has truly represented, I believe, showed that when senators get together and focus on an issue and not let partisan difference separate us, we can accomplish much. And I think that although there have been differences between us, as there are differences on this issue because of its emotion, they have never moved out into the public domain by the Chairman or myself. There are others who have written about our differences, but not us. We have not commented on those differences, and I respect the Chairman for that immensely, and look forward to writing the final report on the issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator McCain.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to say, as a person who has, a member who has attended practically every hearing of this committee, with you and Senator Smith in particular, I'd like to express my appreciation to both of you leadership that you have shown, the ability to work together. And as I said at the White House just a couple of days ago, Mr. Chairman, to the President, you have conducted this committee in a nonpartisan fashion, not a bipartisan fashion, but in a nonpartisan fashion, which is appropriate for the issue. But the fact is that there were times where obviously all of us could have taken a different view, or in the view of some, perhaps exploited the issue. The fact is that you have treated all members with equal consideration. You assembled an outstanding staff of people, you and Senator Smith, and I believe that what this committee will report will satisfy the majority of the American people who are concerned about this issue. Not all, but the overwhelming majority. So I'd like to express my personal deep appreciation for the way that you have carried out your duties as chairman of this committee. I'd like to also add those words to depict Senator Smith as well. History will show that this committee would not have become a reality if it had not been for the tireless efforts of Senator Smith. Senator Smith is the most dedicated member of the United States Senate, perhaps the most dedicated American I know, to resolving this issue. And yes, as he mentioned, we've had differences, but the fact is that there is no doubt about his commitment to resolving this issue, and I appreciate his dedication and his loyalty and his patriotism. I'd also like to again thank our staff, the people who put together a very difficult agenda, who have, I think, done all the work and gotten very little of the credit for the achievements of this committee, and they deserve the majority of it. So I think there will be question, Mr. Chairman, by many as to whether this committee should have had a charter for 1 year or 2 years or more. And frankly, I think that's up to the leadership and the majority of the United States Senate to decide, obviously with our input. But during this year of existence, I think that all of us can look back with some satisfaction that we have at least assisted in alleviating some of the misery and terrible trauma that has affected so many people, as was clearly indicated in the hearings that we held yesterday and the witnesses that we saw yesterday. Also, yesterday's witnesses indicate that there's still a great deal more that needs to be done, especially in satisfying the questions that the family members still have about the fate of their loved ones, not only from the Vietnam War, but also Korean War and World War II. Finally, I'd just like to thank General Vesey. For many years now, he has served as the President's special emissary. He has a military record unmatched by anyone. He's a man who has taken time from his retirement years after 36 or 46 years of military service to undertake an arduous task, and one which I think has been not only commendable, but the finest example of what public service, both military and non-military, is all about. It's been a great privilege and pleasure for me to know him, and when the history of this effort is written, I think that General Vesey will be depicted as our hero. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator McCain, and thank you for the comments. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Vesey, we're delighted to have you back. Your distinguished service to our country as a soldier, I think, was summed up well by Senator McCain. It's been outstanding service in the history of our country. I believe the service you're rendering now, while less glamorous and perhaps in some ways tougher, is likewise an exceptional service to our country. And you have not only my thanks, but I think the thanks of everyone who put on the uniform of this country. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Brown. General, welcome again. I think this is a reprise of several times for you, but rest assured this is our last one, and in a sense, given your stated intentions to the President that I overheard to try to finagle a new job or a different pastime, probably your swan song appearance, you are already sworn before the committee, and obviously I don't need to remind you, but do so simply by saying that about the oath before the committee. And we look forward to your testimony this morning, General.
Chairman, Senator Smith, Senator McCain, Senator Brown, it's a pleasure to be back here again and try to help the committee with its important task. As I said in my prepared statement, the questions which were addressed to me in the letter inviting me appear to be more appropriate for the witnesses that are going to follow me, so I'm not going to address those specific questions because they're better able to tell you what the Department of Defense is doing. And I'd like to just use a few minutes here to put on the record the results of my latest trip to Hanoi and then summarize my views of where we are now and moving toward the lowest possible accounting.
General, could I just ask you to pull the mic a little closer, and I think we'll get a more sustained volume.
And I apologize for my voice. I have an Arizona cold. In my testimony before the committee in November of 1991, I told you that we had begun to see a little progress in access to information from Vietnamese wartime archives. I also told you at that time that we needed far greater access and cooperation in that area if we were to move as rapidly as possible toward fullest possible accounting. In June of this year, I believe I told you that more progress had been made, but we still needed even better access to archival information if we were to move forward. As you know, Mr. Chairman, in October of this year, Senator McCain and I led a party to Hanoi for meetings with the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Defense Minister. During those meetings, we secured the agreement to have the Vietnamese governments search its military archives for information about missing Americans, move that information to their military museums, from which the information would then be made available to joint U.S.-Vietnamese archival research teams. The information would then be used to further the joint investigation seeking fullest possible accounting of all those missing. As the Department of Defense witnesses will tell you in a few minutes, the archival research teams are in Vietnam and are working now to retrieve that material. Soon after I returned, I contacted the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and asked them if there weren't some sort of advanced technological support they could provide for this very arduous task that we faced in sorting, gathering, collating, recording this information. Those teams have been in contact with SINCPAC and the task force, and I was assured yesterday that that project is on a fast track, as Admiral Larson will undoubtedly tell you in a few minutes. A few weeks after our visit, you, Mr. Chairman, led the committee on another visit to Hanoi and obviously reinforced the points that Senator McCain and I had made. Your visit was important for a lot of reasons, but certainly one of its major contributions was help in solidifying the very important agreement on access to archival material. That long-sought agreement to get at the Vietnamese wartime archival material puts in place what I believe to be the last piece of procedural machinery that we needed to get to the fullest possible accounting. A lot of difficult work lies ahead. We're not done, as all of you have said. In fact, it's only like just beginning now, because much work will be required, and we will have to ensure that we dig for this material and not simply accept what the Vietnamese offer. I spent some time with Mr. Destat yesterday afternoon, who heads the archival research team in Hanoi. I come away with a great deal of satisfaction that he and his team members are digging. They know how to dig. They know what to dig for, and they'll get the information that we need. As I've told the committee before, from the very beginning, our first priority was to shed as much light as possible on the question of whether or not there were live Americans in Vietnam left from the war, either prisoners or living freely. As you know, we've pursued two courses of action. The first was the joint investigations of the discrepancy cases. Those investigations began in 1988 and continue today. Many thousands of man-days of American investigator time has been spent on the ground in Vietnam searching for the people we thought had the best chance of being alive. The second course of action was to set up a procedure for investigating the unresolved live sighting reports. We now have an agreed procedure, and those investigations are underway, as you and the committee determined when you were over there a few weeks ago. The joint investigation procedures should provide the framework for continuing the investigating of all the other unresolved cases after we finish the work on the discrepancy cases. And the archival material that's currently being evaluated will be absolutely invaluable in those investigations. On the matter of remains of missing Americans, as I told you in November of 1991, Vietnam has agreed to search for, recover, and return the remains of missing Americans. There's a lot of dispute about how well or actively they're pursuing that, but the effort continues today. We've agreed to provide technical support and assistance in that effort, and here again, the archival information will be absolutely invaluable in pursuing the recovery of remains. Since May of 1991, we've had a functioning office in Hanoi to coordinate and support the investigative work. As the committee members surely observed on your latest visit, the office has continued to increase in value to the effort. Major General Needham, the task force commander, is here today and will be with you in a few minutes, and I'm sure that he and Admiral Larson will give you the current status of those investigations. To take advantage of the increases in Vietnamese cooperation, the United States made some significant organizational changes in the POW-MIA area in the past 2 years. The Secretary of Defense established that task force subordinate to the Commander-in-Chief Pacific. It seems to me that from my looks into the matter that the Secretary, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the services, and SINCPAC are providing good support to that task force. And the Secretary also established the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for POW-MIA Affairs. I think there's plenty for both of those outfits to do. And I watched the television broadcasts of your hearings yesterday, and you can see from the trauma of those families that there are a lot of loops that aren't closed here. And as Senator Smith said, I think he hit it on the nail on the head when he said that there's all sorts of old information that's been in there that probably hasn't been given to these families, and they need to go back in and dig that out. So there's immense work to do to make sure that the loops are all closed, and certainly the committee has been invaluable in identifying those. Now, on the diplomatic side, Mr. Quinn told you on Tuesday of this week that we've had increasing contacts between senior officials of the two countries. We've established channels of communications. Both governments have said that they want to improve relations, and both understand that cooperation on POW-MIA is important to moving toward those improved relations. We've cooperated on a number of other humanitarian issues, and I won't go through them in detail. I've covered them before with the committee. However, when we look at the issue of Vietnamese cooperation, it would be a mistake to forget the progress in reuniting several 100,000 separated Vietnamese family members, getting over 60,000 Amerasian children and family members out of Vietnam, and getting the former South Vietnamese officers and government officials out of the re-education camps, and getting them and their families out of Vietnam if they wanted to go. We've facilitated non-governmental humanitarian help for Vietnamese people. We've also provided some modest but important U.S. government assistance. In summary, Mr. Chairman, cooperation on humanitarian matters has grown steadily over the past 5 years. For us, the most compelling and vexing humanitarian issue has been resolving the fates of our missing comrades and providing the answers to the families. I believe that we now have in place the necessary agreements with the Vietnamese government. We have correctly organized within our own government. We have competent people working on the matter. But again, I say there is a lot of hard work ahead, and a lot of cooperation will be required on both sides if we're to get the answers we seek. And I would like to say again to you, Mr. Chairman, thanks, and thanks to the members of the committee and the committee staff for the important work you've done. Your work has helped achieve the latest agreements with the Vietnamese and has been very important in helping explain the issues and their importance to to senior Vietnamese officials. But even more importantly, it's been important in explaining the issues to the American people. Your report will be invaluable to the next administration, to the military departments, to the Department of Defense, not only in dealing with the issue at hand, but in deciding how to organize to deal with similar types of matters in the years ahead. And I would leave you with one point, that we are in Hanoi and we are digging into their records. Whether or not the Vietnamese can provide the answers more readily than providing them, we don't know. But we have a mechanism for getting the facts in each of these cases, and we need to pursue that mechanism vigorously and get the facts and let them speak for themselves. And I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, Senator McCain, the committee staff for the cooperation and courtesy that you've shown me. And that ends my prepared statement, Mr. Chairman, and if there are questions, I'm prepared to answer, I hope.
Thank you very much, General. I think for all of us, it's been a great pleasure working with you, and I've been delighted to have the opportunity both just to get to know you and also to try to help move this along. Let me ask you, if I can, sort of some of the larger questions, and then we'll get into some of the smaller. You've been involved with this issue now, and again, I ask you to bring the mic a little closer. When did you first become involved as presidential envoy and specifically with the POW-MIA effort?
Well, I was asked to take on the job in February of 1987, the job of presidential emissary.
So from 1987 to 1982, you've been slugging away at this.
Yes, sir.
When did you make your first trip to Vietnam in that effort?
August of 1987.
And since 1987, how many trips have you made to Vietnam?
6.
In the course of those 6 trips to Vietnam, General, you've met with most of the top leaders of the country, have you not?
Yes, sir.
You've had private meetings with them?
Yes, sir.
You've had the opportunity to raise this issue in the most personal way on behalf of the President of the United States?
I have.
Have you, in the course of those meetings, confronted the Vietnamese repeatedly with the question of live Americans in their country?
I have.
And what have they responded to you each time?
We hold no live Americans.
Has money been offered to them? Deals been offered to them?
No, I have not offered money, but I've made it clear that it is the fundamental basis upon which we can move forward in any fashion.
The return of anyone who is alive.
Right.
And so, from 1987 until the present, in any of your missions as a personal envoy, has anybody ever come to you and suggested to you there is some way in which we can get live Americans back?
No, sir, quite the contrary. The senior government officials have continued to say that they not only hold no live Americans, but they know of no live Americans living freely in the country.
Now, what do you say, General, to somebody who says, well, General, they haven't told you the truth before, why should they be telling you the truth now?
Well, that's exactly the point I raised with the Vietnamese, and that's why I said it is important that we investigate these cases of people that we thought had a chance of being alive, that we knew to have been alive at one time, and we need to know the answers.
Okay. Now, with respect to the issue of, I mean, can you sort of share with us your thinking about the possibilities of their, quote, returning someone alive to us now? Now, I keep hearing people come to me and say, Senator, we haven't offered them the deal. Just offer them the deal. Have a high-level negotiator go over there, and by God, you know, you put it to them and you get them back. What's your response to that? I mean, we thought you were a high-level negotiator, yes, General. We don't want to diminish that, but that's what we keep hearing on this committee, and I think the American people need to hear this aired a little bit.
I think there is no prospect that that would happen. It is almost beyond the realm of comprehension for me to figure out how the Vietnamese leadership can say after X number of years that they have no one, and then say, now we do, and we'll do it for X million, billion, or whatever it happens to be. Now, it's possible, I guess, but I find it beyond the realm of comprehension for me.
And as you say, in the course of these years, no one has ever taken you aside as a presidential envoy and suggested to you some way it might be done through Laos, through another country?
No, sir.
Not even a tidbit?
Not a hint.
You said a moment ago that we don't know if there's more to come, really, in terms of access to information, et cetera. What is your judgment today about the level of access and level of cooperation we're receiving?
Well, I think the Vietnamese government, there's a new team in Vietnam, as you know, and I think that the new governmental team that Le Duc An, Vo Van Kiet, Don Quay, Nguyen Mon Cam have all decided to move ahead with this issue, and you can see it in the way that the bureaucracy functions over there now. That you see it with instead of General Needham or even the task force commander dealing with the old VNO SMP people, are now dealing with the Vice Foreign Minister, dealing directly with officials of the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense is clearly now engaged in this activity, so it is far better. Now, I continue to say, as I said in my prepared statement, we have to dig. We have to make sure that we're the ones who have to verify that we're getting the information that's available. We just can't sit there and wait for them to come hand it to us. But I'm confident that we have the teams over there that know how to dig and are digging, and I'm pleased that they are digging and they'll get the information. It's just as in when you and the Secretary of Defense agreed that the material would be declassified and provided to the committee, and there were a lot of workers over there that weren't sure all that was going to come out in this country, and the same sort of thing happens in Vietnam. So
what you're saying is you can have an agreement that you reach with the Secretary General or the President or the Ministry of Defense, but getting some of the folks in the department itself to respond is no different than it is here.
That's right. And we
you guys listening to that?
and we have to continue to work to make sure that it's carried out.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. They basically, in response to the questions that Senator Kerry asked you regarding, you're asking about live prisoners, and I'm always saying no. I would say that's true. They've said the same thing to me and others who, as far as I know, everybody who's ever talked to them from the government. Of course, they also said the same thing about archives and saying they didn't have them, and now they've changed on that. So maybe we're making some progress in that regard. Have you ever gotten into the Vietnamese in any detail, General, on how we might encourage the Vietnamese to help us more with Laos? We've had the trilateral meetings, but I understand they were pretty much a failure. They didn't really result in much. What do they say about that?
Well, of course, the basic pitch is that what happens in Laos, we have to deal with the Laotian government, and we understand that, but we need the Vietnamese help in information about those people who are lost in areas under Vietnamese control. And they recognize that, and they said they'll help us with it. And I think that they've agreed to do it, and we just haven't found the right procedure to do it yet, but that's doable, and I'm confident that General Needham and and his people will be able to work that out. And it'll take perhaps a little time and more working, but it'll take work. And I would say one other thing on what you said is that they said that when you said they gave the same answer on archives as they did on live prisoners, that's really not quite correct. They've beat around the bush on the archives, but it was never, it was always quite obvious that they knew that we knew that the archives were there and we were going to have to find a way to get into those archives. But it's a different answer you get on live prisoners. I wouldn't, the answers that I have received are not parallel, that is.
Have you, in your years of service and trips over there, you've met with Mr. Khan in the past, haven't you, as one of the, I think his first name is Nguyen Khan, a high-level Vietnamese official who worked a lot on this issue?
Yeah, I have not personally met with Nguyen Khan.
I wondered if do you have any information as to what his whereabouts would be now? He is the one who, according to press reports, I've not talked with him, so I don't know how accurate the press reports are, but allegedly had made overtures to, I believe, Congressman Torricelli to defect, and saying he had information on live American prisoners. And when the last congressional delegation went over, Senator Kerry was not able to make contact either with Khan, and I just wondered if you had any.
No, I haven't. But if he said that, we ought to find him.
Well, I think
and I think that
would be interesting.
I think that's doable.
I have one very specific question, and if you don't have the information at your disposal, I understand, and maybe one of the future witnesses, Destad or somebody who's coming up later, could answer it. But there was a very, I felt, strange case on one of the discrepancy cases that came up yesterday, and I don't know if you happened to see it when you were catching parts of the testimony, but Pat Plumidor, the sister of Lance Corporal Plumidor, who was lost, he is one of your discrepancy cases, and it's interesting because the information that was provided to the family was that, and I won't read it all, but that Lance Corporal Plumidor's death occurred on September 21st, 1967, essentially in a firefight, a ground fight, and Lance Corporal Plumidor's sister, Patricia, was notified of his death and his remains had not been recovered. She was notified by telegram on September 27, 1967. And then it appeared in one of your discrepancy narratives, in which is one of the cases I assume you took up with the Vietnamese with the narratives, and it said, the line in that narrative was that American forces learned that PAVN forces captured Lance Corporal Plumidor and took him away in the direction of Vinh Linh, etc. Is there any, I just wondered if you don't have it personally, I understand, but somebody may have, another one of the witnesses could answer it, but I would just be curious as to why that appeared as a discrepancy case. What is the...
Well, I was absolutely shocked. I saw that on television yesterday, and I was shocked to find that she had learned that he was a discrepancy case only recently. And of course, as I've told the committee before, I didn't pick the discrepancy cases. The experts back here picked the discrepancy cases. And I don't know when the Plumidor case came into being a discrepancy case. And as you know, when we talked about those cases, I think it was last November, no, it was in June, we talked about those cases, how they kept going through the cases, reviewing all the cases to make sure we had included all the discrepancy cases. And I would guess that Plumidor was one of those that was included after they went back through the other cases, but you'd have to ask the rest of the people on that. I think there are two points on that case. Why? Is he really a discrepancy case? And secondly, where did the breakup take place in the system where if we did believe and know that he was captured, why wasn't the family notified? I've talked with Mr. Patak out in the hallway about what I saw on television yesterday, and I'm sure he'll take that under his purview.
Yeah, I mean, the report is a battlefield report, which seems to be
right.
that he was killed. I mean, I just was surprised to see it. I didn't. I just wondered.
I'm surprised on both sides of it myself.
I'll ask Mr. Patak and others when they come up. Senator McCain.
Thank you, Senator Smith. General, since you have been performing these functions as the President's emissary for many, many years, I'd like to sort of get some opinions and views that you hold as a result of these many years of involvement in this issue. There's no other American who, in an official capacity, has been involved in this issue as you have been. And also, by the way, there's not many people that know that you served for a period of time in Laos during that conflict, which gives you also some perspective on the issue of missing in action during the Laotian conflict. Have you ever heard of any offer of a ransom for live Americans?
I have not.
Have you ever heard of anyone gave you information that maybe if you met with someone or if our officials met with someone?
No, I've heard the suggestion that the chairman made, that is, that somebody ought to make, go to the Vietnamese and offer a ransom, but I have never heard a specific suggestion to say, go talk to so-and-so. And
do you believe that that would be a good idea, to say to the Vietnamese that we'll give you a couple of $1 billion if you'll give us any live Americans?
I think it's a bad idea.
Why do you think that would be a bad
idea? Well, there are rules of international warfare. There's the Geneva Accords, and I believe that that we should promote civilized behavior among nations, and that we all ought to respect the dead, captured in warfare according to those rules, and that we should expect nations to abide by those rules. In the case of the Vietnamese, I think the agreement that I started out with on the Vietnamese is let's start from today. Let's start from August 1987. We cannot reconstruct or redo what occurred between 1973 and 1987, but let's start with today, recognizing that we both want to resolve this issue, and let's move forward from today. So therefore, I just think it sets a very bad precedent. You know, it'd be like salaries in the NBA.
General, during the past years, there has been very credible evidence presented in the form of testimony by a former mortuary worker that as many as 250, 300, 400 bodies were warehoused in a mortuary in Vietnam, in Hanoi. Now, as you know, one of these individuals was polygraphed and passed the polygraph. Some of the remains that we've had returned clearly indicate that they've been kept somewhere for a period of years. What is your view on this whole issue of, quote, warehoused remains?
Well, I think that we need to look at what we know about remains, and there are certain things we know. One is that the Vietnamese did issue instructions to their subordinate military and political authorities for what to do with American casualties, whether they were alive or dead, and if they were dead, what to do with them. And the DIA has constructed a good briefing on the steps that were in this Vietnamese process. And the first was that they were to, for example, if there were an air crash, they were to find the local people were to find the crash, find the pilot if he were alive, capture him. If he wasn't alive, find the remains, then bury them on the spot, and then report the location of the grave to the central authorities. And then the central authorities clearly had a system for recovering those remains at a later date, some 1, 2 to 5 years later. and then sending those remains to central storage. Now, there are a wide variety of theories now on what that produced in central storage. We have the case of the mortician whose evidence, at least, is credible in the terms of he said he saw this, and that's one set of eyes, and it's not clear how many he counted and so forth, but clearly he says he worked on 230 sets of remains himself, so that's quite good evidence. Now, the question of whether or not there are still hundreds in storage is the basic question. I've taken the four-step DIA model, which some people say produces X hundred still there, despite the fact that 500 sets, or actually about 400 of might be Americans, have been returned. That they still produce maybe 500 sets in storage. So what I did is I took the four-step model and assigned subjective probabilities to each of the four steps, because it's a compound probability problem. If I went to the Air Force and I said, what percentage of peacetime crashes produce remains? And the answer is 70%. So you start out with the 0.7, and certainly the wartime probability can't be any better than 0.7. Then you say, well, what's the probability then of the people finding the airplane and the remains and recovering them and burying them? Well, if it crashed in a local area, I'm sure it's close to 0.1, or it's 1. But if it crashes in a remote area, I don't know what it is. So I said, well, let's just say 0.7. Maybe that's good, maybe it's not, but it's not bad for starters. Then what's the probability of the grave being reported accurately from people who buried the remains without a map, reporting its location, and then it's surviving the three things that would affect it, that is the Southeast Asian weather, and scavenging, which was taking place, we know, and general shifts in the terrain due to other matters. I don't know what that probability is, but say it's 0.7. Then what's the probability of going back 2 to 5 years later and finding that grave that was reported, whose location was reported by people who didn't have a map? Say it's 0.7. If all those are 0.7, then the product of the compound probabilities is about 0.24, which means about a quarter of the air crashes in North Vietnam would have produced remains in central storage. If you don't like those probabilities, raise all the other probabilities except the 0.7, and you still only come up, if you make them all 0.9, it doesn't get any better than 0.5. Now, maybe the Vietnamese were better than that. I doubt it. So what I say is the number of remains that some people expect to be in storage is too high. It doesn't stand. We don't know whether they hold remains or not. And what I believe, though, now is that we have in our hands the keys to get to the answer to that question. I just talked to General Needham and said, you know, if you just have a quick reaction remains team out there with Vietnamese and Americans, and when something comes out of the archives that shows that so-and-so was killed and his remains were in the hands of the Vietnamese at a given time, that's the set of remains we ought to start looking for right now.
Including those photographs that we have.
The photographs are screaming examples, right, where the remains haven't come back. Morrissey. You know, we don't know what these people did with, or Morrison. We just don't know what these people did with Morrison's body, but we know that they had it at one time. They photographed it. What happened there? Let's get it and move on from there. So I think we have now the tools to get to the answers, and what we ought to do is pursue them. I think going back over there and saying, you're holding remains, and having them say, we're not holding remains, is a wasted exercise. Whether they are or not, we don't know, but let's start with what we do know, the common knowledge that we have. Morrison is dead. You had his body at one time. what happened to the remains and start from there. And I think that will get us to the answer.
General, the greatest enigma concerning this whole issue to me has always been the dramatic discrepancy between those Americans who returned, who were shot down and captured over Vietnam, North Vietnam, and those who were shot down and never returned over Laos. We went through a conversation about that yesterday with Admiral Stockdale, but the statistics are glaring, as you know.
Yes.
Basically, only returned 9 American pilots from Laos, and we know there was extensive air operations over Laos, not at the level of risk, clearly, as there was over North Vietnam, but those numbers have always been a very significant factor, in my view, in a logical discussion of full accountability, and I'd certainly like to hear your views on that.
Well, personally, I think more answers are deserved from the present Laotian government than we're getting. I think that they need to be continually pressured for more answers. But secondly, there's another reason that the accounting will not be as good from Laos as it was, or is it likely to be from Vietnam. You've flown over the area. It's very rugged terrain. Most of it is very rugged. But the other thing is it is very sparsely populated compared to Vietnam, which is quite heavily populated. Laos is very sparsely populated. The second thing is that Laos is not as homogeneous a nation as is Vietnam. It's tribal, ethnic groups that are split up in various places. The communication during wartime was miserable, and I doubt that it's much better today. And all that contributes to it. But I think more answers are deserved. Now, the other point is that many of those people were shot down by Vietnamese armed forces who were then in Laos. And the Vietnamese have to help us answer those questions.
I have, General, one of your missions, of course, was to make recommendations to the President and to the American people. Do you feel that it's appropriate for the United States to reciprocate by moving forward to some degree along the roadmap in return for what is perceived by many as dramatically increased Vietnamese cooperation on this issue?
I think it is. I think that the Vietnamese government has made a very conscious decision and an important step, and one that was difficult for them to make, to get their bureaucracy together on this, what they viewed as classified information. And that is, we've laid out a roadmap which indicates that there will be corresponding movement on each side. I think now is time for an appropriate step. I don't believe that now is the time to immediately announce normalization or necessarily lifting of the embargo, but I think it is time to make a step, and then we should expect further steps from the Vietnamese and continued cooperation. But I think it is important that we move forward.
Yesterday, Admiral Stockdale testified that there will always be, especially in a war that you lose, a number of unresolved cases. I wonder if you had a view as to when we reach closure on this issue and under what circumstances.
Well, I don't know exactly when we'd reach closure, and I think we ought not to close it off completely. We ought to do as we've done in other past wars. If people are missing, they're still missing, and we'll continue to look for them if that's possible. There are a lot of my comrades in World War II that are still missing, and we're still turning those people up, their remains at least. So we ought not to write the bottom line on this, just as we haven't on World War II or even World War I or Korea, certainly. But at the same time, we ought to move vigorously to get off the list the cases that we can resolve. And I think that the mechanism is now in place to do that, and I think that that we're going to see things accelerate. And I would hope in the next couple of years that we make a whale of a lot of progress on this thing.
You and I have discussed, and I mentioned to Admiral Stockdale yesterday, this very tragic situation that exists when a person is listed as missing or captured, especially in the case of the air war. There were cases that we know of. Admiral Stockdale cited one yesterday where the plane hit the ground, exploded, no chute was sighted, but with the knowledge that if that person is declared dead, that all benefits cease after the death gratuities, insurance, etc. If the person is listed as missing, then the pay and benefits continue for an indeterminate length of time. Have you got any idea how we can get around this dilemma, General?
Yes, I'm not
First
sure.
Of all, do you agree that it's a very...
It's something that drives us making inaccurate reports. The very fact that you deprive your comrade's family of their livelihood by declaring him dead, and so the inclination generally has been, if there's any doubt at all, move toward the missing rather than face the facts. And I think we ought to look at the whole emolument business, how we deal with casualties and what happens to them. I think therein lies the answer to that. I think the present system will drive us to the same problems that we had from the war in Vietnam.
Thank you. I thank the indulgence of the Chair and the Vice Chair. I outlasted my time. I thank you. I thank you, General Vesey.
Thank you very much. General, a couple of, again, sort of larger thematic questions here. You have how many years of service? 46, is it?
Sure.
46 years of service.
Right.
So you've served in all of our wars since World War II. World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
And Laos.
And Laos.
and not World War I.
No, sir, I didn't do that one to you. I didn't say all the wars of this century. I said all the wars of recent vintage. Chose my words carefully. Your judgment that you've expressed today is, and you've expressed it previously, that you personally don't believe somebody's still alive. Is that correct?
No, I have never said that. I personally
that.
don't believe that somebody is not still alive. And I've been accused of that, but what I told you, I think at the first hearing when I was asked that question, is that when I took on this job, I said I'm not going to conjecture about whether there's anyone alive. Let us find the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. Now, I would tell you that based on what we've learned over the 5 years I've been involved, I think the probability of anyone being alive is far lower than I would have given that probability 5 years ago. But I'm not going to say I don't believe there's not anyone alive. I think the probability is very, very low, but it's certainly, it exists. The probability exists.
Okay, I don't want to deal with probabilities. That's not what I was getting at. What I was trying to get at is this question of judgment about evidence and what we've learned.
Yes.
And what I'm trying to get at, and the reason I measure it against your years of service, is that the minute somebody suggests well, let me ask you, is there any evidence? Have you come across any evidence that somebody's alive?
All the evidence we have that people are alive exists in the state of the cases, the discrepancy cases at the time of the incident. That is, the serviceman survived his incident, and we believe he was captured or likely to become captured, or in those live sighting reports. Those are the two bodies that indicate that any American is alive. The investigations of those cases have turned up no new evidence that would support those original conclusions that the people had a chance of being alive. And contrary, in many of those investigations, they've turned up positive evidence that the person is not alive. And of course, you need to go into all those, in each of those investigations, but my general conclusion, having read all of the reports, is that all of the evidence gathered points toward death.
I understand that. Now, the reason I measure it against your years of service is that the minute somebody draws that kind of conclusion or says there isn't evidence, I can't find the evidence, some people in this country immediately take that person and rather than look at the evidence objectively or rather analyze how you may have come to that conclusion, they jump and suggest that you are therefore part of a conspiracy because you haven't come to the conclusion they want you to come to. Now, how do you deal with that? What is your advice to us as a former battlefield commander and general, and how do you speak to that? I mean, you're obviously not a traitor to your country, and you're obviously, at least in my judgment, not somebody joining in a conspiracy, but you've sat here after dedicating years of your life in retirement to finding answers, and you can't find credible evidence, correct?
Thus far, we have not.
So what do you say to those people who throw you into a conspiracy?
I guess what I would say what I've said to those who've confronted me personally, I said this is not a religious issue. It's not a religious issue of faith. It is something, it's a human issue, a material human issue on this earth, and there are facts that will disclose the answer to the questions we're seeking, and let's find the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. In the meantime, you can have all the hopes that you want, but don't turn it into religious faith that somebody's alive when we don't know whether or not they're alive.
General, how many cases? You personally went back and read the so-called discrepancy cases, correct?
I did.
And just to re-articulate to people who may not know what that means, a discrepancy case is a case where we knew the person to have a good parachute, we saw them land on the ground, but then we never knew anything else. Or we might have seen them or heard that they were taken into captivity but not known for certain. Or we might have known that they were in captivity but then they didn't come back. And those are the questions, are they not, that raise the most immediate presumption this person might have been alive, what happened to them, correct?
That is correct.
How many of those did you find out of the 2,266 that, or more that you began with? How many of those real sort of, quote, questionable cases did you find?
Well, as you know, the list that I had, there were 135. And as I told you earlier, I didn't pick those. Was not the one to decide which one was a discrepancy case. I read them after the people who have a lot more intimate knowledge about the issue than I decided this was a discrepancy case. And then I read the discrepancy case to make sure that I was assured that it was in fact a discrepancy case, that there was enough there to make an issue with the Vietnamese, and that in fact it was a good case.
And where do we stand today, 7 years later or 6 years later, and particularly a year and a half after really getting this moving? Where are we with respect to those cases?
I think the next crowd can tell you better where we are. And they'll tell you how well we are doing at evaluating the information and putting it into a decision process, and that question needs to be asked.
General, in your estimation, do you think we're doing pretty well at getting accounting on that process?
We're moving along. We're getting the information now. We're getting the information out of Vietnam, and and we're investigating now how well we're doing at the processing and evaluating and going back to feeding back to the Vietnamese the results and the need for more and so forth. we have in the past been slow in that sort of turnaround, but General Needham and his folks, I'm sure, have got the idea of moving that forward on their plate, and they can tell you more about it tonight.
Well, thank you very much for your, yes, Senator McCain.
General, have you seen, I think that, have you seen and heard of these books that have been coming out, Kiss the Boys Goodbye and Soldiers of Misfortune?
I have, yes, sir.
Have you got any view about those?
Well, someone gave me a copy of Kiss the Boys Goodbye, and I didn't read the whole book, but I went through certain parts of it, and I looked for parts that I thought I might have some personal knowledge about. And I must say that those parts, my view of the facts were almost diametrically opposed to the facts purported by the author.
Does it make one better understand why we dug up Zachary Taylor?
It might. It might. But I think it also makes us understand the important work that this committee has done. I think that, and I don't want to cast any aspersions on people who have views that are different from the government's view or my views. I think what you've done is expose for the American people the strong emotional grip that this issue has on America, and it exposed also the trauma of the families, and you've also exposed the real difficulties in finding the answers to the questions. And again, I want to commend the committee.
And you also, finally, you had also heard of these appeals and money-raising organizations for a long period of time. Have you any views on that?
Well,
those operations.
I'm embarrassed that former service people are involved in some of those things. And I guess I would say that to those who want to question me about whether or not they should put money in those operations, I tell the people who ask me that question, I said, the only answers that have been found through the government's efforts and not by outside efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Daschle.
Chairman, I just had one question. Senator McCain asked you about closure, General Vesey, and you had indicated that other wars have produced similar circumstances where closure has always been very difficult. We've set a very unusual and strict criteria with regard to closure on the outstanding cases. That is, the remains have to be returned. Could you be a little more precise, General Vesey, on your recommendations to us with regard to whatever we might write in the report having to do with closure? How would one, if one assumes that that you would change that criteria at some point, how would you specifically attempt to change the criteria with regard to specific closure?
I'm not sure I would change it. I think that if a person is missing in action, he is in fact missing in action. And if he doesn't come back or his body isn't returned, he continues to be missing in action. And that's not a dishonorable situation. I have a lot of friends who are missing in action, and they were great soldiers. So I don't think there's anything dishonorable about that. Now the question comes for us is, how much searching do we do? And I think here realism has to come into the matter. And what we have to do is, in these particular cases, I think what we need to do is make an honest search through these things. We've promised these families we're going to make an honest search, and let's make an honest search. But then let's be straight up with the families and say, you know, we've made this honest search, and this is what we've done in searching for your loved one, and it does not appear to be a fruitful search to go on any longer. And I think that requires some judgment, and the judgment mechanism needs to be put in place.
Does an honest search require a certain deadline? Does it imply a deadline?
No, I don't think it implies any deadline. As I told the committee before, my youngest son has just returned from being our oldest son was deputy chief of mission in about Papua New Guinea, and he kept telling me about the American teams coming in there and recovering remains from World War II that were recovered in Papua New Guinea in the past year. So I don't think there's any deadline. We shouldn't write the fellow off. He's still missing, and if the remains return or if something new comes up, we should search for them.
Very good. Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me just follow up on Senator Daschle's question. To me, the issue is not so much, I think the committee has again and again said, you don't close the book on any case. You just don't. If somebody's missing in action, they're missing in action, and if you can ever find something, but there is obviously this issue of how actively the search goes or can go after you've been out 7 times to the same location. Clearly, there may be a diminishing return. But the question arises in terms of cloture. We have this list of people, 2,264 now. When we began this a year ago, it was 2,266, so it's down 2. But in point of fact, we know that it isn't 2,266 or 4. We know. I've read a lot of those reports. And I must say to you, I kept reading some of those reports because I was looking forward to confronting some officials and saying, if you knew this about so-and-so, how could you not have done X, Y, and Z? And yet, when I read the report, I said, now, wait a minute. Can I fairly ask him? Because as I read that report, I think that person's dead. And there was sufficient information in the report to draw that conclusion. Now, you don't have returns. You can't shut the case. You don't have the remains, so you can't shut the case, and I'm not advocating that. But do you continue to list the person in this category of POW/MIA when you actually know the story of what happened to them? You just can't find the remains.
That's a very important point, and it's important for not only the executive branch, but for this committee to make that clear in your report. And I think it's important in our dealing with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese, we continue to say they're 2,364, and we're going to search for the 2,364. In fact, with the Vietnamese, we could take the list of 2,364 and we could sit down and start lining out names of people that we are not going to search further for right now, or at least try to hold the Vietnamese accountable for these, because it is absolutely unlikely that they can provide any answers. But what I don't want to do is overstep that thing. It calls for a serious search of each individual case, saying, what should we do with this case? And where do we go? Is there something we can do with the Vietnamese? If there's nothing we can do with the Vietnamese, let's take it off the list of things we're going to hold the Vietnamese accountable for. I think it's very important in dealing with them, because for them this obstacle looks insurmountable.
Thank you very much, General. We appreciate your testimony, and we very, very much appreciate what you've done in this issue. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks to the committee and the committee staff for your courtesies and very important assistance in this matter.
Thank you very much, General.
Thank you, General.
If we could ask the second panel to come forward, Admiral Larson, Major General Christmas, and General Tom Needham. Notice the way the high brass is all out there. They're out there. Yep. All the subalterns run out to get the high brass.
I told you, Larson.
I didn't know he's a hell of a guy. While we're waiting for the next panel to come forward, there they come. Anyway, let me stop here. Go that parade. Gentlemen, if I could just leave you. Have you all been sworn previously? Admiral Larson, you haven't. If I could just, you'd raise your right hands. Do you swear each and individually to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Admiral and Generals, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We're delighted to have you here. It's good to see you again. Thank you very much for your help and assistance and briefings to the committee when we came through Hawaii. And General Needham, I hope you're feeling better. I know you were.
Yes, sir.
I know you were really hurting during that trip, and we're delighted to see you back here. I must say your color is a lot better. I've never seen a guy so pale for 5 straight days. We are very pleased to have you here this morning. Your testimony and the job you're doing are both critical to this committee's work. We've looked forward to this evaluation. I remember a year ago, General Christmas, when you were here and you told us what you planned to do. We've had the privilege of watching some of those plans unfold and be implemented, and we've had the pleasure of seeing some of the results that those plans have already delivered. And I think the American people will be surprised at the amount that has been done, and I think the families, hopefully, will be pleased at the level of effort that is now being expended and that the progress is being made. So let me, without further ado, open up your opening statements, and we look forward to an opportunity to have some questions. Admiral.
Mr. Chairman, Senator McCain, Senator Daschle, it's good to see all of you again. I had a written statement I'd like to submit for the record, and with your permission, Mr. Chairman, give some summary comments.
Terrific.
Here.
The full statement will be placed in the record as if read.
As you know, 11 months ago, I was given operational responsibility for this expanded POW MIA effort in Southeast Asia. And what really produced this responsibility was a rapidly changing world, which offered improved openness and access and some new opportunities in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. And we felt that the time was ripe to really to expand our long-running POW MIA effort. And I specifically asked for this responsibility because I wanted to bring unity of command, a central focus, and a concentration of resources on this very important national issue. And one of the first challenges that I faced was establishing a proper organization to do this job. And I decided to approach it the way I would any other joint military type operational operation in my AOR by assigning a single joint commander to work directly with me. And this would allow me to pull assets and resources from all of my services and tailor the organization specifically for this mission. And so we tailored a joint task force that we call Joint Task Force Full Accounting. And of course, Major General Tom Needham here was the task force commander that we selected. And Major General Ron Christmas here is my Director of Operations, who is my link that works directly with me and with General Needham. I think this has had several advantages for us. It has simplified our chain of command greatly. It's eliminated a lot of the stovepipes, multiple reporting chains, and a lot of the confusion that existed between the field and Washington. And I think quite simply now we can say that policy is made in Washington and we direct operations in the field. And we've got a streamlined structure that runs from me, the unified sync, directly through General Needham, right to the troops in the field and right to the detachments. And they report directly to me through General Needham. I think another result of this that's been good is it's given us visibility at the highest military levels. I get daily reports on the progress in the field and the progress of our analysis. I get detailed weekly briefings on the activities and their progress, and I make frequent reports to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And I'm personally involved in every aspect of the Joint Task Force, from the hiring of personnel to the contracting for office space in our detachments in the 4 countries in Southeast Asia. I have an opportunity to visit all of the supporting agencies, from DIA here in Washington, many trips to the Central Identification Lab in Hawaii to look as they pursue their work. And I've looked at every phase of our operation from Stony Beach, headquarters in Thailand, to my detachments in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Diplomatic considerations have precluded me at this point going to Vietnam, and I would hope that with continued cooperation a trip there will be possible in the future. But I think most importantly I've had the opportunity to visit our teams out there in the field, and after watching the excavation in a very difficult mountainside out in the steamy hot jungles of Laos, with a very difficult helicopter landing zone, as many of you have experienced out there in the field, you appreciate the real enormity of the problem, but also the dedication of the fine young Americans that are out there working in the field to try and solve the fullest possible accounting of this difficult issue. But I think approaching it as a military operation has clearly given us the structure and the flexibility and also some objectivity and credibility that's very essential to this issue. Since we stood up the Joint Task Force, we have doubled the size of our operation, and I've just recently asked for another 37 people from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs for the expanded archival research effort, and we're getting support in that. And we've made a lot of progress in many areas, especially in our ability to put people on the ground and to make maximum use of that access. Our Joint Task Force has conducted 5 joint field activities in Vietnam in the last year, 7 in Laos, and 4 in Cambodia. And we have ongoing operations right now out there in the field in Laos and Cambodia. We have done 294 joint field investigations. We've surveyed 149 crash sites or grave sites, and we've mounted 35 remains recovery operations. We have a live sighting investigation program in place. The host nations could still show some improvement in being responsive, but I think the program is in place and it continues to improve. In my testimony about 2 months ago before this committee in closed session, I talked about many things and said that I was really looking for more progress in 2 areas: records and the unilateral return of remains. As you know, we've had a dramatic breakthrough in the records part with the archival access. Our archival research teams are in place, 2 of them over there now. Team 1 has been operating for almost a month. It's reviewed and begun to catalog more than 2,000 photographs, artifacts, and they're looking for correlations to unresolved cases. I think most importantly, in my opinion, we've opened a new atmosphere of openness and a free flow of information to the families. I asked my organization to come up for me what I call a field to families program, and I wanted to audit a field investigation and audit that information flow all the way through to see what obstacles it had to face before it got to the families. And I found out at that time, and this was many months ago, that we had about a 400 report backlog in my organization. So we turned extra resources to bear 24 hours a day, and in several weeks, about 3 weeks, we cleaned up the 400 report backlog, and now we have essentially a free flow when investigations are complete from the field to the casualty resolution offices and on to the families. And we want to continue that pipeline so we get that there as quickly as possible. We have sent over 1,900 new findings in reports through the service casualty offices to the families this year. When I look to the future now and look at where we're going, by the 18th of January, we will have completed our first round of investigations of all of the 135 discrepancy cases or last known alive cases. And that was the focus for our first phase of operations. The 22nd field activity in Vietnam that starts in February of 1993 will shift and emphasize a geographic approach, and we'll start moving through the country in a case-by-case investigation. We'll start looking at all unresolved cases in a very deliberate district-by-district process. And I'm sure that the results that are generated by the archival research teams will be very helpful, because we want to pull that information out and use that to help tailor our investigations. So before I close, I'd like to make 2 things clear here. And I think first that many people and agencies have really made key contributions to our Joint Task Force in this last year. I have received active cooperation from the policy makers here in Washington. I've had a very close relationship and liaison with General Vesey, who incidentally you can't say enough about. He's not only one of my heroes, but he's a national hero and has really gone above and beyond. We've received quick responsive report from the military services in filling billets with top quality people, but also giving me temporary duty type support whenever I ask it for all operations in the field. And I think we've received the right mix of interest and assistance from Congress, especially members of this committee. I think your committee work has been very, very helpful in the overall effort and the things we're trying to do. All of these people, including you, Mr. Chairman, and your committee, have given a lot of time and energy and personal involvement and leadership that have helped open doors overseas. And I know your close coordination with us before you make your trips has always allowed us to open more things up for progress in the future that have been useful to us. So I'm grateful to all those that contributed. But secondly, and finally, I don't think we should have any illusions about the difficulties we still face. We've got a lot of site visits, a lot of investigations, a lot of excavations yet to do. We've got an enormous volume of data flowing out of the archival research teams. It's my policy to keep the pressure on. Just like any other military operation, we're not going to sit back, as General Vesey said, and wait for them to come to us. We're going to test the seriousness of the cooperation of the governments of the 3 countries over there that are involved. We're going to try and push to the limits of what's allowed. We're going to see how far and how fast we can go. And I'm very proud of our progress this year, but I'm confident we're headed in the right direction. But it's no time to rest on our laurels. We've got tough work ahead, and we're going to keep pushing as hard as we can. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the efforts, and we are pleased to be here today to make whatever contribution we can, and the 3 of us are ready to address any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Admiral. I take it you are not going to make opening statements?
Sir, we have given you written statements for the record.
Fine. Well, we'll put both of those into the record. I understand, Admiral, you're a little bit under the gun here. We need to get you personally out of here around somewhere before noon. Is that
yes,
correct? I'm sure we'll be able to do that. I don't question that. How many people are currently in the command and on the ground working in this now, Admiral? Let me just comment also, first of all, I want to say how impressed the members of the committee were and are with your personal leadership on this. I think when we went on the couple of occasions we've been briefed, we have been pleased to find the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet as directly knowledgeable about the details and as involved as you clearly have been. And for those who have been concerned about the level of priority, I don't think there's any question but that yours and General Christmas's and General Needham's leadership is really transferring that priority into a field reality, and so we applaud you for that. I think it's been significant. The reason I ask, I want to get a sense in terms of where we were a year ago and where we are now, what the ground force operation is and what they're really experiencing in terms of difficulties and realities of living and so forth and making this happen. Could you just relate a little bit of that detail to us?
Yes, sir.
Or if you want either General to pipe in.
I might give you just a brief overview, and I think General Needham can give a little more detail. I visited our group out in Laos in the field, where they're living in a very primitive base camp there in the jungle, where they even have to fly in fuel to refuel the helicopters there because there are no facilities whatsoever in this little village, Shipong, out there in the old Ho Chi Minh Trail. And then they're doing an excavation with about more than 30 people working up on a countryside, on a hillside up in the mountains there, just off the trail. Very hot, very steamy. You get leeches, you get dirt, you get a lot of humidity. They're working with local villagers up there. It's a 2.5-hour hike from the bottom of the hill up to the site where the villagers are working. We fly our people in by helicopter. They worked, I think that last thing was over 20 days. I think it was almost 30 days they were in the field there, working from the base camp, going up there every single day, working from dawn till dark, and then returning to the base camp.
And how many people are on the ground in Vietnam and Laos?
Our teams have varied in size from about as low as about 28 to as high as about 63, and it depends on how many teams that we actually have. We shoot for about 70. We'd like to get 5 or 6 teams in the field at a time, particularly in Vietnam.
Now, General Needham, if you could relate to the committee, I was struck. I mean, most people sit in this country and they say, well, why can't you go to the crash site? Or why can't you get out? By God, let's just go look. And I think it's important for people to have an understanding of the logistical difficulties and of the realities out there. I mean, when we're talking about helicopters, we're not even talking about our own right now. And the living conditions are really difficult, to say the least. I'd like you just to share with us your personal sense of that. I mean, I know you've spent a lot of time out in the field, and we talked about it when we were over there, and you were suffering from it when we were over there. I wish you'd sort of share that.
Well, first of all, Senator, let me go back to the numbers. We presently have 40 United States servicemen in Cambodia today. Less than half of those belong to the JTF because the helicopter support is coming from the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division. And therein lies the support that we get from the SINCPAC components. It's virtually unlimited. In Laos today, we have 30 people, less than half, again, that belong to the Joint Task Force. The majority of the other half belong to the Central Identification Lab. In areas that we operate on in the three countries, there are a number of considerations that have to go into the operation. First, the weather. The weather is very dependent on what we can do over there. Secondly, the mountainous terrain that you observed is very difficult to get into. Some of the cases are at extremely high altitudes. For example, a case that you're very much interested, case 1983, which we will be going into in January, is located at approximately 7,000 feet. There's only about 3 months of the year that we can get in there. A helicopter coming in to a landing zone at that location is reduced in what it can carry, and if anything happens, it has very few options. Many of these LZs are very small, can only take small helicopters and require large number of runs to get the force in there. Lastly, I have forgotten over 20 years how hot it is in that country, how difficult the terrain is, how many bugs there are, and how difficult it is to support logistically when we have to carry in everything from water to food. It is extremely tough. Some of the toughest I've seen in terrain that is very hard to explain unless you've actually seen it yourself. Yet our people are out there day in and day out under very trying circumstances trying to solve these cases. And lastly, as the Admiral said, when it comes to excavating a site, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and it's very slow, meticulous, tedious work.
I might just add, Mr. Chairman, to that, the helicopter landing zone that I landed at this little excavation site, which is about 2,200 feet up in the mountains at a slope of about 60 degrees where they were doing the excavation. The villagers and our people had to walk up there and clear the helicopter site out of dense jungle and trees, and the helicopter site was smaller than this space between our two tables here, where we brought this little squirrel helicopter in and landed with about 4 people in it. So it's very difficult to get there.
General, can you speak now to the issue of the level of cooperation that you're receiving? I mean, you're the guy on the ground. You deal with the people. You're the one sort of breaking open the doors and making sure that we're really getting this access. Where are we? What kind of judgment can the committee make based on your experience now over this year in Vietnam?
So in my opinion, in the last year, the cooperation in Vietnam has been steadily improving since I assumed my position in January. Recently, with the visit of General Vesey and Senator McCain and your committee, there's been some dramatic improvements. I think the Vietnamese could still do more, but right now we see cooperation getting better and better every day at the central level. In the field level, cooperation is mixed. In some provinces, it's better than others. In some areas, it depends on the central government team leader or the local officials as to whether it's up or down. We are still, across the board, seeing better improvement, but in the provinces, it's mixed.
When you say it's mixed in the provinces, is that a reflection of a sort of the central government, of the Hanoi government's policy, or is it a reflection of just the difficulties of the provinces? Is it the same kind of problems you might have, for instance, in Washington saying do something, and then in the states you wind up with difficulties? I mean, help us to understand that. What is the...
I think General Vesey alluded to it. It's a lot like our country. Sir, in my opinion, the central government wants to support this issue. You have provinces in Vietnam that were very heavily bombed, and their support to the United States is less than others. You have individuals in some of those provinces that work harder and provide us more support than other provinces. And lastly, sometimes the support from the central government representative that's with us in the province is not as good as some other people.
So are you suggesting that in those provinces where we did the most heavy bombing, that is a direct correlation to where we're getting the least cooperation?
Yes, sir, and there's one province in particular where we consistently run into problems. That's the province of Quang Binh, that is just north of the demilitarized zone. Many of the other provinces, we get very good support.
Mm-hmm. Is it your sense, General, and I ask this to each of you, as you go about this, I am convinced from our visits, and I understand from our personal conversations, the degree to which you hope to find somebody alive and the degree to which everybody is operating on that presumption. But I ask you for a candid statement to the committee as to whether or not you are operating today with credible evidence that shows you that somebody is alive?
Mr. Chairman, I have seen no piece of evidence at this point that would indicate anyone is alive from any of our researches, investigations, surveys, or any of the data that we have available.
General Christmas?
I would echo that, sir. I would also say, however, that as you've indicated, Senator, we pursue every lead. We do not leave any stone unturned, and we have in position the operational plans to recover Americans if, in fact, we should find one.
General Needham?
So I agree. I would add that it's our #1 mission, looking for live sightings in support of the DIA effort. We react to every single one of them. We give it our best shot, and in fact, there's 2 of our members that are up on the Vietnamese-Chinese border today trying to complete the last of the cases that the Vietnamese agreed to do in conjunction with your visit.
Now, how many live sighting reports have we followed up on in the last year?
So I don't have the exact number. You would have to get that from one of the other representatives of DIA.
We have done 40 advance notice live sighting investigations. We have done 16 short notice live sighting investigations, and with all of the data that has come in this last year, we have resolved 143 live sighting cases.
And has any one of those live sighting cases given an indication of either a live American or that there was a live American there?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman. There was no indication of a live American in any of those.
140 some?
143.
Okay. Will the committee be able to, maybe the next panel, will the committee get a breakdown as to the years that those sightings were actually made?
We could provide that for the record.
The year of the sighting and the follow-up and the specific follow-up with them. General, you say there are some things yet to come where you think, where we're looking for greater improvement. Could you share with the committee what those are? What could the committee or other people be trying to leverage in terms of better cooperation or more improvement to speed the process up?
So I think the most important thing that both our teams have to do and the Vietnamese have to do is better preparation. I think once we agree on both governments on the work plan, that both sides need to spend more time in preparation to ensure that when the investigators get to the site, that they can maximize their time and the witnesses are made available and both sides are prepared to proceed with the case. The other thing that we're trying to do is to get the Vietnamese to help us out in the archival research program to support the work plan. For example, they know where we want to go in January, and we're asking them as a part of this renewed research effort to take those cases and help us to see if we can find more information prior to us deploying to the field so that we can have current information when we go to the field to investigate the January cases.
Do you feel, General, that the archival research has truly opened up? Are we really getting access there?
So I think it's too early to tell to give it a final grade, but right now we are starting to see some very valuable stuff come out of the museum in Hanoi. We are trying through Mr. Destat to request information so that we can drive it a little bit and get information that we want and get it on cases that are unresolved as opposed to stuff that we already know. The team in Da Nang just went into place yesterday, and it'll take us a little while to see how they get set up and produce.
What about remains, General? Is it your perception that there's some large amount of remains, or that you could put your hand on a quick group of remains tomorrow?
So I just don't know the answer on the remains. I do know that there are many remains being held by private citizens, and I've addressed that with the Vietnamese because it's against their law. They tell me that they're trying to find a way to solve that problem. I also...
we raised that issue while we were there and
yes,
tried to publicly address it.
Yes, so I also believe that there are some remains being held by the local district and village officials. All of this in the hopes that there will be some monetary reward at some point. But I do not know what the situation is at the central government.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, it's nice to see you again. Sorry I missed the last trip and didn't have the opportunity to meet with you. Some of the the information that we're receiving on your work has been, and some of the cable traffic and so forth, has been somewhat critical of both yourselves as well as the Vietnamese. You know, for example, in some of the things that I've looked at, there was a reference to your last field effort as one of the least successful in terms of comparison with others. Another comment, the Vietnamese have shown no evidence of a serious effort to search records or information or to locate witnesses. One wonders if the Vietnamese see any connection between archival research and field investigation, or they're just going through the motions to provide an appearance of continued cooperation. I'll let you comment in just a second. And the team's freedom of movement was considerably more circumscribed than has been in the case during recent field investigations. And another comment, the increasing number of U.S. government officials of all ranks, both in and out of the Defense Department, who are becoming involved in the issue, has diminished the importance of the joint teams in the eyes of the Vietnamese. They're now just going through the motions, the Vietnamese. They're now just going through the motions in what was once seen as one of the most important aspects of the overall relationship between the two countries. I realize that's an opinion, but give me a reaction to that in terms of what your perception is to those comments. Anyone?
So I'll be glad to take it on, because it sounds like to me that you have a copy of the message that our investigative team number 4 that was in the southern part of Vietnam during the last iteration.
We get it from Bill Bell?
No, it didn't come from. Excuse me, it didn't come from. Yes.
So it sounds like to me that that's the report that came out of investigation team number 4 that worked in the southern part of Vietnam during the last iteration. One of my policies is that we be truly open, and we do not classify any documents, and we allow our people to give us a candid assessment. We knew that we were having trouble with one of the teams in Vietnam last time. We brought to the Vietnamese attention about halfway through the joint field activity. This was one of the ones I referred in kind of mixed cooperation, and in fact we did not accomplish all of the cases down in that area that we'd hoped to last time. However, we hope to bring that to the attention of the Vietnamese and see if we can get them to prepare better. They can look into why it didn't go as well as we would like, and in fact copies of those reports will be presented to them verbatim next Wednesday.
Well, you know, if again, look, in a general sense, if the perception of the Vietnamese is because we've obviously expanded in numbers, that there are a lot of military officers in the field who are not technical experts in terms of excavation, in terms of investigation of live sighting reports, that the Vietnamese are not responding seriously to that. Now, is that a fair assessment, or is that not fair?
I think you have an isolated case there, Senator, and that you have an opinion of a team leader. My perception is that is not widespread, and that's not a general assumption. I think.
Well, what about the technical expertise of your people? Are they linguists, for example?
We have linguists with every team.
You have linguists with every team. How about the background of the officers there in terms of the specifics, the technical experts?
We have a training program for our officers. We have a training program for our team leaders. We have some members that have been with the organization for a long time, and we draw on their expertise to help us train the new members. But as in any organization, there is some turnover. Obviously, we formed an organization that has gone from about 38 people to 150 people, going up to 187 people over a period of a year. And so as you expand an organization, you bring in new people, and you must train those new people. And we have a training program to do that, to bring the people up to speed, to have proper linguists on every team, and to have experienced people work with inexperienced people until they're ready to go it alone, and then to get out there and function. And I think we've done a pretty good job at that.
Well, you know, having been in the military myself, I think, you know, it's the comments that I'm making are meant to be constructive, not destructive. I'm just, you know, military personnel tend to be logistically oriented, command control oriented, and tactically oriented. And I'm just concerned about whether or not the command control and the logistics and that sort of thing and the tactics are overpowering the expertise that's needed to do the job. I mean, you've got a lot of people over there, and I mean, more people can be helpful, and I applaud the effort of putting more people on the job. We talked about this a year ago, and I agreed with you and supported that. But I think it seems to me let me ask the question this way. If you look back at the roadmap, the roadmap is supposed to proceed on the basis of knowledgeability of the Vietnamese. That what do they have knowledge of that they can provide you? And it seems to me, as I hear these comments, that we may be spinning our wheels out on investigations, and the Vietnamese are spinning them for us, when in fact we're ignoring what the Vietnamese may have knowledge of directly. And I think if we're to move and make progress on the roadmap, I think it has to be on the basis that the Vietnamese provide all the knowledge that they have, and then what you're doing in the field in terms of excavations, that's all supportive. I have no problem with that. But I think what we must be sure that they do is provide all of the knowledge that they have, both on live sightings as well as remains, crash sites, etc. And the impression that I'm getting from these reports is that that's not the case. That we are doing this running around out there, but that there is a knowledge base, an archival base that we're not looking at. Not that we're not looking at, but that we're not getting the complete information from.
Well, obviously, Senator, that's exactly why we've been able to start the archival research program, and we would trust that we look at ourselves like a suction hose, and we are pulling from those archival records that have been made available to date as we push the program every bit of information that is possible. And the idea behind that then is that we can turn around and use our successive work plans based on that information that has been given to us. I'd like to comment, though, on the message that you've read. As General Needham has said, we believe in total openness with our teams, and that's what we expect. You have read one team commander's assessment. If you were to read the summary message of all the team commanders' assessments, you would see that the opinions differ. And in fact, in some provinces with some teams, the opinions are very positive, that there was more cooperation than has ever been, that in fact I was able to go here or go there where I had not been able to go before. So I think we have to take that as a whole. That's not a defensive comment on my part. What I'm trying to say is that what we believe in is total openness. We want our folks to say what they think or what they see, and then we in turn act on what they have presented us with.
Senator Smith, if I could add to that, the questions that you just asked, I think are very relevant.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Well, I knew
The questions that you just asked, I think, about logistics and command and expertise and that, I think are very relevant. But I also would like to assure you that I asked every one of those questions in the field when I visited my detachments and my field sites and my people, and I looked at our training programs, and it was very much on my mind. And when I did my assessment. And I am satisfied that we do have a program in place that's headed for the proper results.
Well, you've responded to the question. That's why I asked the question, and I think it's a fair question in the sense that if there are people who feel that way, then I think it's a fair question to examine, on the part of the committee. Let me just ask one more. You probably heard about, if you didn't see, a number of family member concerns being brought up recently regarding learning information through the media or getting information from sources other than the government. What are we doing to protect family privacy here so that information can come out, get to the families before it gets in the papers, and also to see to it that the Vietnamese are not in fact exploiting what information you do get for their own gain?
Senator, in my opening statement, I think before you arrived, I described our Field to Families program, which I instituted several months ago, where I did an audit from information in the field, and I audited that flow all the way through the pipeline to the service casualty resolution offices and then to the families. And I found out that we had a backlog of about 400 reports in our own organization, and we turned manpower on that within 2 to 3 weeks, cleared up the backlog, and have established a process now that every piece of information we get on a field investigation goes immediately into that pipeline when the team is completed, right on through to the service casualty offices and on to the families. And we have filed more than 1,900 of those reports this year, and they've all flowed through the system. And that's a dynamic number because that'll change almost daily.
And to give you an idea of the sensitivity, sir, as an example, when Senator Curry made the last trip and was in the museum, obviously there were a lot of newsmen, and there was the possibility that there were a number of cases that were discussed that the news media would have picked up. We immediately got a dispatch from Hanoi, and we went immediately to the casualty assistance officers in those particular cases and said, notify the families immediately that this case may get into the press because it may have been open, the newsmen may have heard it discussed while the committee was there. So we are very sensitive to that, and we're moving very, very rigorously in that area.
Your job becomes more difficult because in many cases the press are following you around out there, and I'm aware of that. And but I think sometimes talking to them, they can use discretion so that you can get the information to the families. There was just one final point. There was a report in the Philadelphia Inquirer attributed, I won't repeat the name of the individual, I don't think it's necessary to do that, but an individual who was involved in one of the searches in Cambodia, who was quoted as saying, neither one of us, referring to another member of the team, neither one of us are willing to risk the life of a 19-year-old American for 22-year-old bones. Now, I would agree with that if there is a risk involved in terms of a threat to the individual for remains. I think that's fair. But I think in a broader picture, we're also looking at live sighting reports, and I don't think the comment is very fitting for a military person to make a statement like that. I think that any military person who doesn't feel that the risk is worth taking for investigating a live sighting report ought not to be there, in my personal opinion. But I don't know the exact circumstances of what, I know it was Cambodia, and I know there's Khmer Rouge is making things very difficult for you over there. So I understand the context. But I think if the statement refers strictly to bones, fine. But if in a broader context, I think it has, it is a concern, and I think a justifiable one.
Senator Smith, I would like to respond to that. I have not seen the article. I have not seen the quote, so I can't attribute anything to it. I can't even tell if it's accurate, and I can't even tell you if one of our people said it. But I will tell you this. I've been in Cambodia, and I've been in Laos, and I've been in the field with our people. And it's dangerous. It's probably one of the more dangerous places I've been recently, and they're there willingly. And when I went up to that excavation site where they flew in by Mi-8 Chinese-built Laotian-flown old helicopters and then trudged up that mountainside and did their digging and doing their gear, those people were upbeat. They really felt that they were doing something important. They're doing an excavation where an OP-2 crashed and 9 people were aboard. And those people felt that they were doing something important in their country. They were happy. Many of them were people we just conscripted from our components to do manual labor that were over there voluntarily.
Well, I certainly don't mean to imply they're not.
One young man got there because he was soldier of the quarter at his post, and that was his reward, to be able to go to the field and work on this very important issue. So I guess I take exception to a quote that I know nothing about, and I can't attribute to any of my people.
First of all, I want to let you understand, I'm not saying that refers to the other 149 people that you have working out there at all. I'm just saying it's a statement. It reflects, if it's accurate, it's not, I don't think, a good reflection on the work you're doing. I just want you to be aware of it. Thank you.
Yeah, for now. Senator McCain.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to discuss this?
Go ahead. Whatever you want.
It's up to you. Well, I've already, yeah.
Do you mind if I follow up?
No, but I just don't give you
The committee has obtained a report that I just read, which is a routine message. I believe this message was sent in December, I believe, summarizing operations between 18 October to 28 November 92. Are you familiar with this message?
I'm not sure. I get them every...
I have read that message, sir, and I can speak to it.
Well, this message, of course, is, as you may know, is, I'd like to ask the Chairman, Vice Chairman, do you think it's appropriate to ask about this message?
Absolutely. I'm going to ask about it if you don't, so
You
please.
see the note on the top,
Sure.
I mean, that's what it was provided to me, so I think we should have tried
Sure.
to abide by that, that's all.
Absolutely. But you are familiar with the message, General?
Yes, sir.
Perhaps I'd direct my questions to you. The Vietnamese have shown no evidence of a serious effort to search records for information or to locate witnesses. One wonders if the Vietnamese see any connection between archival research and field investigation, or are just going through the motions to provide an appearance of continued cooperation on the issue. Were you informed of this?
So I knew that team was having difficulty. They were working in and around the Ho Chi Minh City area out in Tay Ninh province. We brought it to the Vietnamese attention. They said that they would look into it. We intended to bring it to the Vietnamese attention again next week. Additionally, we think that since we hadn't got the operation into the Ho Chi Minh Museum, there might have been some reluctance on the team leader down there from the Vietnamese side to let us into the museum ahead of the central government program that they knew was coming to final resolution to put the team into that museum. But there's no doubt, sir, there's no doubt that team did not get the support that we would have expected, and I think that the central government wanted us to get.
How many teams do you have operating?
Sir, at that particular time in Vietnam, we had 4 investigation teams and 2 recovery teams. We felt that of the 6 teams, that 4 received good support and 1 received mixed support, and that team did not receive good support. And you'll later on this morning, one of the team leaders from that particular trip into Vietnam, Master Sergeant Dieter, he's here, and you might ask him the cooperation that he got. He was working just north of the team leader that you're referring to there.
Would you say that this team's statement, the Vietnamese have shown no evidence of a serious effort to search records for information, is typical, is atypical, and if it's atypical, or whatever your answer is, can there be anything be done about it?
So it's my estimation that when we go into Vietnam with 4 or 5 teams, generally one of the teams runs into severe trouble. That, as I said earlier, is generally attributed, in my opinion, to 3 areas. Number 1 is where they are in the country. Number 2, the representative from the central government may or may not be as helpful as he could be. And lastly, the preparation done by the local officials prior to them arriving for that period of joint field activity. We are addressing this with the Vietnamese. In fact, next week we intend to tell them that we think this is the number 1 thing that we've got to concentrate on now is better preparation and bringing the archival research in a timely manner as we head to the field so that we're working with the latest data on both sides.
How do you reconcile your statement to the committee, which said, and I heard, the cooperation is increasing, you're satisfied with the level of cooperation, you're satisfied with the information that you are getting, and yet this one team of yours says one wonders if the Vietnamese see any connection between or just going through the motions to provide an appearance of continued cooperation?
Sir, as I said, that cooperation could be better and cooperation is mixed. I think at the central government level that they have a plan that wants us to get good support. I think all of their representatives all the way down the line do not totally support the central government program, and what you have there is an incident that we repeatedly run into. Generally, 1 out of every 5 or 6 teams does not get the support that we would like, and I think that the central government expects them to get.
Would my colleague
could I just comment, though? In fairness, that's basically what your opening statement was, General. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, I think one has to look at the reality, and I'm not a witness here, but I want your comment on this. I mean, in each of the trips that I've taken, where there was a high visibility to the presence of United States senators, and Senator Smith was with me on one. And we met with the General Secretary of the party, and we met with the Prime Minister, and we met with people, and they said, we want you to be able to go anywhere. We're going to set it up, and boom. And so we go out into the countryside, and we go somewhere. We get somewhere, and some functionary has his interpretation of what he thinks our instructions are to be able to do, and in this particular case, it was a prison. We were only supposed to be able to go into one area. We had the deputy minister with us who said, no, 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 they're supposed to be going anywhere. It took 2 hours of phone calls back and forth to Hanoi, people saying no. Finally, they said, oh, you can go anywhere. I mean, it seems to me there are difficulties out there in the field you're going to run into, which is why we're working at this process. But I mean, would you comment on that? I mean, are you finding, or are you not? Because you've told me this personally. We've talked about it at great length on the airplane, about the difficulties within local regions of getting the word out, where you have some people who've spent 20 years fighting the United States of America who all of a sudden see Americans coming in and don't quite know how to deal with it.
Sir, Master Sergeant Dieter is going to tell you about his team leader the last time he was in Vietnam from the VNO SMP. He's going to tell you that they gave him pretty darn good support. That team leader gave us terrible support 3 months ago. We brought it to the Vietnamese attention. I am told by the Vietnamese that they disciplined the guy, and he made the 100% turnaround in just 2 iterations. And I think that the Vietnamese government, when we bring the attention to them as to what happened on this period, that they will give us a reply. I would also like to add, Senator, that documents like that probably don't serve our Joint Task Force in the best light. But I have not restricted what's put out. I will not allow things to be classified. And you're seeing a document that came out from an individual who has his opinion, and we will take his opinion, and we will work at it at our level, and we will work at it with the Vietnamese to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Well, I think it's very, if I just want to finish one thought here, and that is that it's very interesting to me that somebody working in your group doesn't feel very comfortable with what's happening and wants to try to use this one document, which they've slipped to us, to assert that everything you're saying isn't true and the Vietnamese aren't cooperating. I mean, that's the purpose of this little exercise here.
I don't know that that's true, Mr. Chairman. I take issue with that.
Well, I mean, are you getting cooperation or aren't you, I suppose, is the question. And is this indicative of the broad base of where we are? I mean, is the committee being hoodwinked? Are you being hoodwinked?
Sir, as I have said before, generally on a rotation into Vietnam of 5 or 6 teams, and we're hoping to go to 7, there will be one team that will run into problems. That was the team for this time.
Thank you, General. And Admiral, how many of these messages do you have?
Sir, at the end of each exercise, each team leader sends us a message stating how his team did, what we need to do to better prepare the team, and how the cooperation and support was from the local officials to his team.
Admiral, would it be appropriate, and I do not want to do if it's inappropriate, but would it be appropriate for you to give the committee all of the messages that you've received, and that way we can get a better judge, because
I have no restriction whatsoever, Senator.
Then perhaps we could get a better overall assessment of the success from their viewpoint as well as yours. So if you could get those to us, I think maybe then we can view it in the not questioning your statements. I'm not prepared to do that with you or General Needham or General Christmas. But if we could get all these situation reports, I guess is the best way to describe them, or after action report. I don't know exactly the terminology, but if you've got these, maybe you could give all of them to us so that we can have the staff review them and maybe get an overall picture of their view of the cooperation as well as yours. Would that be appropriate?
We will provide those for the record.
Okay. And Admiral, you wanted to comment, I think, on General Needham's.
Yes, I would agree with what General Needham says. What I get, Senator, is a summary report after each evolution, and they summarize every team and go through all the aspects of the operation, from logistics to research to the information gained. And I think that's an accurate portrayal. We normally have about 1 team out of 5 or 6 that has a problem. And we have some provinces that are tougher than other provinces, and I think it's not unlike our country. I think if you sometimes go out to different states, you'll get different levels of cooperation on issues depending
Is it
on
a
what they are.
correct statement that the overall trend from your viewpoint, from your overall viewpoint, has been improving, the same, or deteriorating?
From my viewpoint, the overall trend is improving, and the overall trend is improving because the central government has made a decision that they finally must cooperate. The archival research is part of that, and I think we are going to continue to have to work very hard to get that word down to the provinces and get them to go along, because I think not only is there difficulty in their bureaucracy in getting the word down, I think there are going to be people down in those provinces that don't agree with that central government decision. They're going to want to be resistant to that.
And is it your assessment that a compilation of all of these reports would corroborate your assessment of the improving cooperation level of cooperation?
I would say yes, Senator, with one caveat, is that I think the decision to cooperate was made about the time that your delegation made its trip. So if you look back historically over the last several months, you may not see that improvement, because I think the ramp takes off about the time of the delegation's last visit.
Finally, and I thank you all for that, and we look forward to getting all the messages so we can get an assessment. Finally, General Needham, tell the committee, if you would, about the health conditions of many of the health problems that afflicts many of these teams in the field.
Well, sir, it's very difficult. We have had some cases of malaria. Some of our people in Hanoi have been sick, and we're working at that. There's also a Japanese encephalitis problem in the Hanoi area. And in fact, we have our medical team going through the 3 countries right now, trying to make sure that we're doing everything we can to take care of our soldiers. We also are working very closely with the representatives of the 3 governments, because their team members in the field are getting sick just like we are, and they're experiencing some of the same problems, especially with malaria, that we are.
If you have recommendations as to how we can do a better job of alleviating some of the health problems, maybe the conditions just dictate that that's a risk of doing business there. But if you have any recommendations, we'd certainly be pleased to hear about them. I thank you all, and Admiral, I think you're doing an outstanding job as Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Forces in the Pacific. Thank you.
Senator Daschle.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Smith has asked if he could, before I begin my questions, take a minute, and I have no objection to that.
Senator Smith can always be recognized.
Thank you, Senator from South Dakota. I just want to respond. I totally agree with what Senator McCain has just said, that all documents, cables referencing the matter ought to be included as part of the record. And since I introduced the comments, I want to clarify, because it's been mischaracterized, frankly, as to what I said and the intentions and everything else. I simply read a comment out of that document and asked for your response to it. I think the record will clearly show that. I didn't say that that was a fact. I didn't say that that was the nature or the characterization of your work. I made no comment, no editorial comments at all about that in my statement, or I'll stand on the record on that. I've simply said that's what was said in the document. I think there are other documents that have been, in the cable traffic which would agree with that. There are many documents that will disagree with it, and you have made your comments. It was simply put out there as a way to, it was not addressed in your opening remarks, that part of it, and it was simply a way to address that concern. You've addressed it. I have no problem with your answer, and I don't attribute any sinister motive for the providing of this document to anyone. It's there to get on the record certain disagreements, and I have no reason to challenge the validity of your statements or the statements that were made in that. We have differences of opinion on the committee. You have differences of opinion in your work. That's a fact of life, and it was just brought up for that reason. And I just want to make the record clear on that. I thank the senator for yielding.
I assume my time was protected, but I did.
Your time is entirely protected, Senator. And in fact, if I could just comment and continue to protect your time, my problem with that is not with the methodology here is not with you, Senator Smith, at all. It's appropriate for Senator Smith to ask any question about that. It's appropriate for any senator to ask any question, and clearly anything that ought to be asked, we ought to be aware of and we ought to ask. But I'm a little bit concerned when the committee is sitting here and a document gets slipped up here that is an internal document. It's one document. It's highlighted as to the non-cooperation, and then questions come, oh gosh, they're not cooperating. Now clearly someone within this process who has access to these things don't like what's happening. They don't like the cooperation. And therefore, they single out this one piece rather than give us all of the documents or a broader view. And it underscores that their problems aren't just in Vietnam, folks, in getting people to want to move forward. Problems are right here at home, too. Right here among these groups, somebody says, gee, they're not really cooperating, and wants to take one little document and use it as a reason to suggest the whole process is corrupt. Now, I ask you, Admiral, General, and General, is the process corrupt? Are these people not cooperating broadly, or do you feel there is this genuine commitment to getting this process to work? The committee wants to know the truth, not some preordained answer.
Mr. Chairman, I think their senior leadership in their central government has made a political decision to cooperate and to try and move forward. The level of that cooperation, I think we have a system in place that will test the level of that cooperation and put pressure on them to produce and evaluate how far they're willing to go. But I think they have made that political decision. I think several of their senior leaders, in fact, are hanging out a bit in hoping, you know, for some sort of reciprocity. I think they've staked quite a bit on opening this up. Right or wrong for what they've done for the last 20 years, I think they've made a political decision. Now we've got to change and we've got to move forward, particularly in the archival research area.
General Needham, do you think that the access you've been given to the archives is just show and tell, picture-taking time, or do you think it's producing real results and will?
So I think it is going to produce results. I think we're starting to see a little bit in Hanoi. I think it's too early to tell exactly how much we're going to get, but I believe we're off to a positive start, and I'm hoping that we can, by the information requests that Mr. Destard has given them, that we can lead this archival research program a little bit more to the way we want to go, which is looking at supporting the work plan and supporting cases that we want to get answers to rather than just getting information for the sake of getting information.
And having worked at this for a year and having served in Vietnam and realizing how this process works, do you think that what happened with the committee, with General Vesey's visit and Senator McCain, and then with the delegation's visit, was in fact the demarcation point of a real shift, or do you think it was sort of let's dupe the Senate committee time?
No, so I think it's a real shift, and like Admiral Lawson said, I think that at the central levels of Vietnam, they have made the political decision to support us in their effort. I think there are some individuals at the lower levels, including some at the central government, that are probably not giving us the support that the leaders would like us to get.
Do you think there are some individuals within this issue here in this country who just don't like to see progress made, General?
So my challenge is to work on the other side of Hawaii. I'm just not that familiar with what happens this side of Hawaii.
Yeah, that's a good Massachusetts bred answer, General. Senator Daschle.
I just want to start by commenting on that work. I must tell you, unequivocally and in as strong a way as I possibly can, I just wish the American people could see, as I saw a couple of weeks ago, the kind of quality of work that's being done by the entire operation. It is the absolute finest. We worry sometimes all through this country about whether we get a dollar's worth for a dollar paid when it comes to taxes. I'd like to tell the American people they're getting more than a dollar's worth. I honestly, honest to God, don't know how they could get more help, more cooperation, more professionalism, more results, more success than what they're getting right now from the team that we have in place. And I just want to say as unequivocally as I can that I know I speak for a lot of American people in thanking you for the job you're doing. It just doesn't get any better. I'm extraordinarily impressed. I was glad to go, but I'll tell you this, I was damn glad to leave. There are a lot of people that aren't leaving, that are hanging in there. And I was staying in some fancy hotel most of the time. You guys are out there in the sticks halfway up the side of a mountain, worried about malaria, worried about encephalitis, worried about just about everything that can be contracted by human beings, and you're doing it voluntarily. That's what needs to be said. So I really have to tell you that it just doesn't get any better, and I for whatever time and attention I can devote to this. I just want the American people to know what an incredible job is being done. I'd like to talk just briefly, if I can, about the operation itself. You mentioned 6 or 7 teams, General Needham. Could you describe a little bit about what the team makeup is? How is it composed?
So we basically, in the country of Vietnam, run 2 types of teams. One team is an investigation team. That team generally runs about 10 people. It has analysts on the team, it has linguists on the team, medic, EOD specialists, and it has Graves registration specialists. They're the ones that are out investigating the priority cases and the other cases in the area that they're assigned. They also, if they find a grave site, they have a small capability to at least make some initial test digs to see if they can come up with something. The second type of team that we run in country is a little bit larger. It generally runs 12 to 20. It is an excavation team. It is primarily led by the U.S. Army Central Identification Lab in Hawaii, and they are going to a site that has been previously found by an investigation team and surveyed where we have reason to believe that there's a high chance of finding remains. The composition of that team starts with a team leader. It has a civilian anthropologist, and it has other members like the other team that I just mentioned to you to take care of the welfare of the people and to try to find the remains.
And what is the organizational scheme of the mission itself? The teams report to whom, and could you go up the ladder for us?
So in the country, the teams report to the country commander. For example, the last time we were in Vietnam, we had 6 teams. Those teams reported to Colonel Donovan, who is our commander of Detachment 2 in Hanoi, and he in turn reports to me in Hawaii, and I in turn report to the Admiral.
And how long has this structure actually been in place and functioning?
So it's been in place and functioning since late January of this year.
What existed prior to that time?
So prior to that time, there was an outfit called the Joint Casualty Resolution Center that was a little bit small, considerably smaller than we are now. They did not have full-scale operations in Cambodia and Laos, and the operation in Vietnam had been running for about 9 or 10 months.
How does, we talked about this privately, but I think it's important for the record, how do you determine the priorities with regard to these cases? Who decides that, and how is it carried out? Admiral Larson, do you want to address that?
Yes, sir, Senator. We have macro priorities by category: live sightings, the 135 discrepancy cases, and then cases in geographic proximity to the 135 discrepancy cases to be investigated in conjunction with those investigations and excavations. And we've moved through that plan in this year.
Let me just stop you. Yeah. Did you say the live sightings are number 1?
Live sightings.
Discrepancy cases number 2.
Discrepancy cases.
And then surrounding cases that may be related to discrepancy number 3?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We will complete on the field iteration that starts in January of '93 in Vietnam. We will complete the 135 discrepancy cases. At that point, we will start with a geographic province-by-province investigation and survey and move through the country working on all unaccounted-for cases.
I remember General Needham saying in Vientiane that you assess the time it will take to do a case and double it because you just never know. With that caveat and completely appreciative of the unknowns out there, do you have any kind of a time frame within which you believe this entire effort can be completed?
Of course, my immediate interest center is the Joint Task Force, and Joint Task Forces by definition are created for a temporary mission, and when the mission is complete, they're dissolved and you go back to a normal structure. My original estimate was about 2 years, that at the 2-year point we should have a good idea as to whether we could continue or how close we were to the fullest possible accounting. At the 1-year point, we will be through phase 1, and we will start into the geographic investigations. I would say by next summer, we'll have a pretty good idea of where we are as we look at the geographic surveys through the country.
The last thing with regard to the operation itself that I want to pursue briefly is case closure. We've talked a lot. You probably heard us talk about the matter with General Vesey, and it's been a particular area of interest for me. Case closure is nebulous simply because of the fact that as we require remains. There is no case closure per se. But how does one judge a successful investigation if ultimately the only way we can completely resolve a case is to bring back the remains? What kind of status is associated then with a case once it's been investigated, and yet a failure to bring back remains is a factor to deal with?
Senator, I view it in the operational context, and let me just take a case or a file. We go out and investigate, we survey, and in some cases we excavate if we can find a crash site or a grave site. We look at the archival research and we look for any information. From my point of view, I keep going on that case until I get to the point that there's nothing more I can do. I'm going out on another field iteration, and I would like to put that case in my work plan, but I don't know where to go or what to do because every lead that we had has been followed. In some cases, the answer may be to the family, we can't think of anything else we can do unless new information comes up, either through the archival research or the Vietnamese give us something that we had not had before. I don't change status of cases or anything like that, but I must make a judgment at some point in time that I can no longer work that case in a field iteration and set it aside pending new information, and then keep working the cases that there is productive, research to be done out there. And that's kind of my operational view of how I view my work package.
That's reasonable enough. We started out with 2,266. We're now down to 2,264. How many of the 2,264 fit the description that you just provided?
I have my people looking at that right now, Senator, and they have not given me the answer. But we're working at, as we put together this geographic work plan, I've asked them to tell me of those cases how many of them are investigative and how many of them is there just no information. And we will be trying to compile our best shot at that data.
When will you have that compiled?
We should have that compiled within the next 30 days.
And at this point, I suppose rough estimates are probably inappropriate. Is there any guess? Could you say 50% roughly, or would you care not to even?
I'd be a little concerned about making an estimate because it might turn out to be wrong, and
okay.
This is pretty tough.
Let me change the course of questions a little bit to talk about remains in another context. General Needham said that, and I don't want to misquote him, but the impression I had is that he believes that there are remains that are known to exist being held by individuals as well as perhaps local government officials. There is some expectation, of course, that some bounty would be paid for remains. We've made it clear that that isn't the policy of the United States. Could it be the policy that we put much greater pressure upon the central government to confiscate these remains? Is that an option that you could recommend to us? And if confiscation is not a viable option, what other opportunities would there be to deal with this question of remains that are being held in the hands of those outside central government authority?
I think, Senator, one of the things, if we could help them get around their law, which makes it illegal for individuals to hold remains.
Well, let me stop you there for just a minute. If it's illegal, why wouldn't it be appropriate for them simply to go in to confiscate remains if they're being held illegally?
I think because of the penalties that would be involved, they would also then have to punish the people that have them. I guess I would try and proceed down a path of a one-time amnesty or something, that for this period of time, if you have remains out in the local villages and you turn them into the central government, then you will have amnesty. But after that 30-day period, anybody found with remains then will be subject to penalties.
Is that being seriously considered?
Sir, that's to be addressed in the technical talks that will take place 10th through the 12th in Hanoi this month. The key is that the Vietnamese have been very concerned that the remains would be destroyed, and therefore they find themselves in a catch-22. And the amnesty suggestion is to be made during those technical talks.
Have you been able to make any assessment as to the numbers of remains that may be held under those circumstances?
Senator, I think that's very hard. I've looked at the DIA assessment, obviously, and I've talked to General Vesey, and I've gone through his probability theory, and I guess I really come down that it's just hard for me to make a judgment. I can make one judgment: there are remains somewhere, because we have photographs of bodies that they had at one time that we do not have remains for. So there are some that once were available that we do not have, and we don't know where they are. So there's certainly an area to work, and I think as we work that, I hope this picture will become more clear to us.
When we were over there, we had the opportunity to talk to Colonel Dye and learn the value of oral history. We had an extraordinarily provocative but certainly interesting description of an account that he was personally involved with. To what extent is your teams get out into the countryside, are oral histories part of the ongoing investigations?
So we've only really done one, and that was of a Colonel Yee about 4 months ago. In talking with Mr. DeStart yesterday, Mr. Sheets, we are trying to come up with a program to follow up on that, because they've indicated to us, based on your visit, that they are receptive, and Mr. Sheets is proposing a plan that would put somebody in there of the knowledge and the background that we need to do that, and which we're trying to bring that to fruition here rather quickly.
I see my time is just about up, but let me just finally ask about the deadline. We talked about trying to complete the live sighting investigations by I think it's the end of next week, December 10th. Are we going to be able to maintain that schedule? To what degree are you satisfied, if we can meet that schedule, that we have exhausted our live sighting investigations?
Senator, I don't think we'll ever exhaust the live sighting investigation, because they keep coming in. We still have 99 unresolved cases, so they come in as we resolve them. We've picked out the priority ones. DIA has assessed those as priority, have given them to us, and we've pursued those as fast as we can in the field. And I think we will complete all those they gave your committee. I think the last one is up by the Chinese border now, that the folks are up there today working on that one.
We had about 8 or 9, I think, when we left, and you say
this is the last
those
one.
priority
Yes,
cases
sir.
are all...
Colonel Cole may have a later update, but the last report I has, we were down to 1, and that one was up on the Chinese border, and Colonel Cole's given me an up, and they're up there right now. In fact, may have actually finished it, but it's one that takes a couple of days to get up there and a couple of days to get back.
But as an example, we have 24 more cases that have just arrived in Bangkok, and we'll
24 more live-sighted
correct.
cases.
And we will begin, 8 of those are reinvestigations, but we will begin a program then to move on with those 24.
Now, are these
so
live sightings that have just recently occurred, or are they old live sightings that are being turned over to you for the first time?
Most of these are old live sightings that have been screened and presented to us for either investigation or reinvestigation. Most of the ones I screened, I think, were probably 4 or 5. Some of them are 4 or 5 years old, but they're not all, current that are happening right now.
I am out of time, but let me just finally ask: can you associate a cost with each of these live sighting investigations? Is there any way to, as a rule of thumb, do they? I suppose they vary substantially in the amount of time and effort and resources it takes to do them.
Very difficult. I don't believe I could break that out. I don't think that.
I don't think we can, Senator, because it depends on where it is. For example, some of the ones that are relatively close, you can do by vehicle to Hanoi. Ones that you have to use a Vietnamese helicopter and fly in another aircraft to get there, it gets rather expensive to pay for the helicopter, and that doesn't even consider the time it takes our people.
Well, the reason I ask, because I was involved with one. I flew from Ho Chi Minh City to Da Nang, and then took 4-wheel drive vehicles down Diem, which was 76 kilometers, and it took us almost a day to get there. And then, obviously, to do the investigation took even longer than that. We had to keep some people up there, as you know, and I was extraordinarily impressed with the incredible amount of effort it takes to resolve one of the live sighting reports. And I was curious as to the allocation of resources in that
So
regard.
if I may add that the one that you went on is a pretty typical one, and those DIA guys are out there working awfully hard. You saw the living conditions. You saw how long it takes to get there, and sometimes they just have to stay overnight in that facility to get the job done. Yet they're out there doing their best to complete those as they've been assigned to them by Washington.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of quick ones, and we'll actually perform a miracle for United States Senate organization. We'll get you out on time. I think we have about 6 minutes, but I want to ask quickly. Laos. We haven't talked a lot about Laos. What's the level of cooperation in Laos?
Mr. Chairman, I'd say the level of cooperation in Laos is mixed. It's sometimes a case of a step forward, 2 steps backward, 2 steps forward, a step backwards. And in my honest assessment after being there and having some conversations looking, I have great difficulty telling how much of it is bureaucratic ineptness and lack of cooperation in a very primitive government, and how much of it is policy driven in that there's some resistance to cooperation. Clearly, there's more cooperation on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs side and less on the defense. In fact, the defense people didn't want to let me in country, and I was allowed to come in as a political guest of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when I visited my detachment, my people in the field.
Some people have asserted, sorry to interrupt you, but some people have asserted to us that all you need to do is put the pressure on Vietnam and that'll solve Laos. They control them. Do you agree with that?
That's not my assessment from what I've seen. I think it's much more complex than that, and I think they've made a step forward on the last iteration after my visit and then after your visit, and maybe it's the 2 steps forward and we don't see the 1 step backwards later, but it appears, in my view, that they have, they've given a couple things. They've let the one native Lao American interpreter come in. They've agreed to look at a live sighting mechanism. So some of the things we've pushed, they've started to agree to, but it's still very inflexible, very rigid, and much more difficult to deal there in the field.
Now, with respect, and I'm sorry to harp on this, but it's a critical component of why you've flown this distance and why we want the authority of your office and the experience you bring to this, each of you here and on the record, and it is important to the committee. There will be some who will take an example here, an example there of problems in the field and say we're having struggles, and we understand that. And if there are overall struggles, we want to know it. But we also want to know what your judgment of your mission is at this point. Are you confident that you are in fact making progress and that you think that if we continue down this road we can get answers? Or do you feel there is a significant something missing that the committee ought to know about and articulate so that we can change it?
Mr. Chairman, I'm absolutely convinced that we have the proper command structure, organization, people, priorities, and approach in place to do the fullest possible accounting. I think the key to it is what will the Vietnamese do and what will the 3 countries over there do, particularly the 2 countries of Laos and Vietnam. But I think our system that's in place will allow us to evaluate that. I think for the first time I've got the resources to continue to push and to continue to press and to make them produce in the things they promise to produce and to evaluate what they give us. So I think the system is there, but I think the key to success is on the other side and what they're willing to do for us as this system goes forward.
And is it your perception as you go forward that the promises with respect to access to archives, the live sighting report follow-up, I take it, they made a promise to us they would finish the live sighting reports by 10 December, correct?
That's correct.
So people said to us, well, they've made promises before. Is it in fact true that it now appears that will be completed by 10 December?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I take it that's progress.
That's progress.
What about the archives? I now gather we're reaching into Da Nang, we're reaching into Ho Chi Minh City, whereas a few months ago we weren't even in Hanoi.
That's correct.
Is that progress?
That's progress.
Okay. So I take it is your judgment that we are moving down the road.
My judgment.
Is that your judgment, General Needham?
Yes, sir.
Yours, General Christmas?
It's certainly my judgment, sir. If you remember, we talked before about the agreements that were made between Lee Mai and then Assistant Secretary Solomon. 5 agreements, expanded operations, live sighting mechanism, archival research, and so forth. Of at least 3 of those, we have had substantial movement. and substantial progress from the February of this year when those agreements were made. So there has been progress. And what we need to do, as the Admiral has said, is just keep pressing.
Now, with respect to the pressing, when we were there, we pressed in a very personal way, General, as you remember. I mean, you take a photograph of a person like Morrison, and you know the person is there because they photographed him. You know the person is deceased. And they ought to be able to produce a remains. I mean, that's our judgment. We think they ought to be able to produce a remains. We said that to them. You were there. We're still waiting. What's your judgment about sort of those missing links here, where we have a real sense that we had a person who was a prisoner and we know they're deceased, but we don't yet have the remains? What happens in that confrontation, General?
So the one area that I just don't know what answer to give you is the remains. I can give you a scenario that Morrison was buried in an area and maybe they lost the records. However, we are working with them, and we have presented those cases to them. We're going to talk to them more about it next week. I believe that, as Admiral Larson said, they are trying to find a way to get themselves out of this situation because they are concerned about the laws. They're also concerned about taking remains from individuals that, and convincing them that they have no chance of getting any money somewhere down the road.
So, again, that could possibly be one of those instances where someone has in fact dug up the remains, as we know people have, and possibly is hoarding it, and you can't get a hold of it. Is that what you're saying? Or wouldn't there be a record, some record of where the person was buried, conceivably? I mean, if you have a photograph, one would say, hey, gee, somebody might have written down where this person was or something.
I think we've got to wait and see what answer they give us on those specific ones that we have asked them, and we have another group that we intend to ask him on.
But those issues are up front and center, obviously, right now.
We're giving them by name the list and say, you have to account to us for these.
Well, we're on the button here on time. I want to thank you very, very much, all of you. You've not only traveled a long distance this way, but you've been back and forth out there also. It's certainly my judgment, I think shared by the committee, that you folks have carried this thing a long distance. We're delighted to hear that the team and the capacity is in place. That is obviously critical. And needless to say, we and all of the concerned parties wait anxiously to see this process produce the results and to get this accounting that we want. And we wish you well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we look forward, obviously, to hearing your team in much greater detail as they testified.
I might just say, Mr. Chairman, if I could, to show a little bit of the dedication of the gentleman on my left here, Tom will be leaving today for Hanoi, because he's going to get right back out to the field and get to work. And I would like to also point out that he was routed by the U.S. Government Travel Service. He's got about 7 stops en route because it saves $30. So we're getting our bang for our dollars, Senator Daschle.
I must tell you, I'm not sure I'm delighted to hear that. The $30 we save may not be worth the hours of your time and experience, but anyway. General, if it's possible to catch a word with you before you do go back, there are some things I think we on the committee would like to have you put directly to the Vietnamese, and we'd like to chat with you.
I'll be here all day, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We're going to take a 5-minute break while the next panel sets up. 5-minute recess.
You're watching C-SPAN coverage of Friday's meeting of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs. At this point, the committee took a short break, so we will use this opportunity to update our schedule for you. Our coverage of Friday's hearing will continue in just a